Have you ever walked away from an argument, replaying every word, still convinced you were right, even after hearing every counterpoint? Have you ever felt a surge of certainty about a decision, only to realize later that your confidence was built on something flimsy, a gut feeling dressed up as logic? Or found yourself defending a belief, not because you had new evidence, but because changing your mind felt like losing a piece of yourself? If you are willing to see yourself in this mirror, subscribe and stay with me. Here is where the reflection starts. The shortcut that feels like evidence. The week after a plane crash, airports go quiet. People who have flown 100 times without a second thought suddenly grip the armrest or cancel the trip altogether. It feels like the world has changed, but the numbers barely move. Statistically, flying is still safer than driving to the airport. Yet for a while, every takeoff feels like a coin flip with fate. This is not just nerves. It is the mind's shortcut for danger, and it is astonishingly persuasive. The more vivid the memory, the more real the risk feels. After September 11, 2001, millions of Americans avoided planes. They drove instead. Gerd Geigrenzer, a German psychologist, ran the numbers. In the year after the attacks, an extra 1,500 people died in car crashes, deaths that would not have happened if they had flown. The fear was real, the risk was not. This is the availability heuristic, a term coined by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in 1973. The mind does not tally up every fact. It grabs the first thing that comes to hand. If you can picture it, it must be common. If you cannot, it must be rare. The shortcut works most of the time, but when it fails spectacularly. Think about shark attacks. Every summer, a single bite makes the news for weeks. The odds of dying from a shark attack in the United States are about 1 in 3.7 million. You are more likely to die falling out of bed. But nobody lies awake, dreading the mattress. The shark is vivid. The bed is boring. The mind is not built for actuarial tables. It is built for stories. The same trick works in reverse. Lottery winners beam from the front page, holding giant checks. Their names become household words. The odds of winning the Powerball jackpot are 1 in 292 million. But the story is so bright, so sticky, that it feels possible. You remember the winner. You forget the millions who bought tickets and went home with nothing. Tversky and Kahneman found a way to measure this shortcut in the lab. They asked people a simple question. Are there more English words that begin with the letter K, or more with K as the third letter? Most people said, begin with K. It feels easier to recall, but there are actually about twice as many words with K in the third spot. The mind mistakes ease for evidence. If it comes to mind quickly, it must be everywhere. It is like the first headline you saw that you cannot unsee. The story that flashes across your mind when someone mentions flying, or sharks, or the lottery. It does not matter how many quiet, uneventful flights you have taken. The crash is the one that sticks. The shortcut is not just a quirk. It is a design feature. The brain was built to grab what is vivid, not what is true. You are right to feel uneasy about this. Because if a single story can outweigh 1 million invisible data points, then the world you think you know is shaped by what you happen to remember, not by what is actually happening. The mind is not a census taker, it is a storyteller, and it loves a good headline. So the next time you feel certain about a risk, a trend, or a fact, ask yourself, is this confidence built on numbers, or on the first story that came to mind? Because memory arrives faster than math, and the shortcut that feels like evidence is often just the mind's way of saving time. But if a memory can tilt your judgment, what happens when the very first number you hear gets there first? Anchoring, the number that moves in and refuses to leave. The wheel is rigged. You know it. Everyone in the room knows it. Still, you watch it spin, land on 10, and suddenly the question comes. How many African countries are in the United Nations? You have no idea. But your answer, somehow, hovers near that 10. Next group, same question, but the wheel lands on 65. Their guesses shoot up, as if the wheel had whispered a secret. This is not a trick for children. In 1974, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman ran this exact experiment. The wheel was a prop, a joke, a number generator with no connection to Africa, the United Nations, or anything that should matter. Yet the numbers it spat out dragged people's estimates behind them like a magnet under the table. The group who saw 10 guessed, on average, that African countries made up about 25% of the United Nations. The group who saw 65 guessed 45%. The only difference was the number they had just seen. It gets weirder. The researchers told participants the wheel was rigged. They said out loud that the number was random and irrelevant. It did not matter. The anchor had already done its work. The mind, desperate for a foothold, grabbed the first number in reach and started building from there. You want to laugh at the absurdity. A wheel of fortune, a trivia question, and suddenly your sense of world geography is off by a continent. But the joke is on all of us, because anchoring is not a party trick. It is the default setting. Real estate agents, the kind who have walked through 1,000 houses, will appraise a home higher if you show them a fake listing price first. They will swear they are using their own judgment, but the anchor drags their number up or down all the same. Salary negotiations work the same way. The first number on the table, no matter how wild, becomes the center of gravity. Even when both sides know it is a ploy, the final deal orbits closer to that anchor than anyone wants to admit. It is like seeing a price tag in a store before the sale. You know the discount is coming. You know the original price is a fiction. But when you see the new number, your brain cannot help but compare it to the first. The anchor is sticky. It moves in and refuses to leave. And here is the part that should make you uneasy. Even experts, even people who know the anchor is nonsense, cannot fully escape its pull. The mind is built to grab the first thing it can and start counting from there. The anchor is not just a number. It is a starting point for reality. So the next time you hear a number, any number, ask yourself if it is a wheel of fortune in disguise, because the mind does not care if the anchor is random, rigged, or ridiculous. It just wants something to hold on to. And numbers are only the beginning, because change the wording and you can make the same fact feel like a different reality. Framing. When survival rates and death rates become different stories. You are sitting in a hospital conference room. The air is still, the coffee is burnt, and the doctor at the front of the room is about to describe a new treatment. This procedure, she says, will save 90% of patients. Heads nod. The mood is cautious, but hopeful. Then she clears her throat and repeats herself, but with a single change. This procedure will kill 10% of patients. The room chills. The same faces, the same numbers. But now the air feels heavier. The facts have not changed. Only the frame has. This is not a trick of language. It is a trick of the mind. In 1981, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman ran an experiment that would become a classic. They called it the Asian disease problem. Imagine a disease is coming to your city. 600 people are at risk. You are given two options. If you choose Program A, 200 people will be saved for sure. If you choose Program B, there is a 1/3 chance that all 600 will be saved and a 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. Most people, faced with this choice, pick the sure thing. 200 lives, guaranteed. It feels safe. It feels right. But then the frame shifts. Now, instead of lives saved, the options are described in terms of lives lost. If you choose Program C, 400 people will die for sure. If you choose Program D, there is a 1/3 chance that no one will die, and a 2/3 chance that all 600 will die. The math is identical. The outcomes are the same. But suddenly, most people switch. They become gamblers. They take the risk. The certainty of loss feels unbearable, so the mind lunges for the chance, however slim, to avoid it. This is the framing effect. The brain does not just process numbers. It hears stories. It feels the difference between gain and loss as if they are different worlds, even when the numbers are twins. In the Asian disease problem, 72% chose the sure gain when the frame was positive. Only 22% chose the sure loss when the frame was negative. The facts did not move. The mind did. You see this everywhere important. In medicine, a surgery described as having a 90% survival rate is chosen more often than one described as having a 10% mortality rate, even though both are the same. In public policy, a tax cut framed as letting you keep more of your money feels different from one framed as reducing government services, even if the dollar amount is identical. In advertising, a yogurt labeled 10% fat sits on the shelf, while the one labeled 90% fat-free flies out the door. It is like walking into the same room under warm light and then under cold light. The walls have not moved. The furniture is the same, but your body feels it differently. The mind is not a calculator. It is a mood ring, a weather vane, a storyteller that cannot help but color the facts with the light it is given. That should bother you, because it means preference is not anchored to reality. It is anchored to the story that gets there first. Two statements with identical statistics can trigger opposite decisions because the brain hears gain and loss as different worlds. The floor beneath language is not as solid as you think, and once words change the picture, the person wearing the white coat or the sharp suit can change it even faster. Halo effect, one bright trait lighting the whole face. Edward Thorndike was not looking for a trick. In 1920, he was just trying to measure soldiers. He asked U.S. Army officers to rate their men on intelligence, leadership, and character. The results should have been a scatter of strengths and weaknesses. Instead, Thorndike saw something weird. The same men kept getting high marks across the board. Handsome soldiers, in particular, were suddenly not just good-looking. They were smarter, braver, more disciplined, more everything. Thorndike called it the halo effect, one bright trait lighting up the whole face. You have felt this. You meet someone with a dazzling smile or a voice that lands just right, and before you know it, you are filling in the blanks. If they are charming, they must be clever. If they are confident, they must be competent. The mind does not stop to check. It just lets the glow spill over. Thorndike's original paper was blunt. He found that physical appearance shaped ratings of intelligence and leadership, even when the raters had no evidence for those traits. The effect was not subtle. It was a flood. A single positive impression could drown out everything else. This is not just a military quirk. In 1974, psychologists Landy and Segal ran a study where students read essays supposedly written by either attractive or unattractive authors. The essays were identical. The ratings were not. Attractive authors got higher marks for quality and intelligence, even when the writing was the same. The glow of beauty made the words look smarter. It gets worse. In classrooms, teachers' first impressions of students, how they look, how they walk, how they answer on day one, can shape academic evaluations for months. A 2016 meta-analysis found that early expectations, based on appearance or behavior, quietly warped grades and feedback all year. The first impression is not just sticky, it is radioactive. And then there is the world outside the lab. Celebrity endorsements are a billion-dollar industry built on the halo effect. A famous athlete or actor appears in an ad, and suddenly the product feels more trustworthy, more effective, more worth your money. It does not matter if the celebrity knows anything about the product. The glow is enough. In 2012, researchers Amos, Holmes, and Strutton showed that celebrity endorsements boost consumer trust and product ratings even when the star has zero expertise in the field. Fame is contagious. So is the illusion of competence. You might think you are immune. You are not. Hiring managers routinely rate candidates higher if they are tall, attractive, or have a firm handshake. Students with neat handwriting get better grades. Politicians with the right kind of voice win more votes. The mind is not weighing evidence. It is letting one bright lamp make every object in the room look warmer. Think about your own living room at night. One strong lamp in the corner, and suddenly the whole space feels cozy. The shadows soften. The colors warm up. You do not see the dust in the far corner or the crack in the paint. The light does not just illuminate. It flatters. The halo effect works the same way. One trait, beauty, confidence, fame casts a glow that hides the flaws and invents strengths that were never there. And here is the part that should make you wince. We routinely promote people for being impressive in one way and then act surprised when they fail in the job we imagined around them. The charismatic founder who cannot manage, the star athlete who cannot coach, the celebrity who cannot govern. We built the job around the glow, not the substance. That should bother you, because the next time you feel yourself trusting someone a little too quickly, you are probably not seeing them. You are seeing the light bouncing off the first thing you noticed. And if a face can win your trust, imagine what simple familiarity can do before a single argument is made. Mere exposure. Why repetition feels like truth. Robert Sajonc did not set out to trick anyone. He just wanted to know what would happen if you flashed a nonsense word, something like Kadurga or Werbus, in front of people, over and over, until it started to feel like an old friend. In 1968, Sajonc ran his experiment. He showed volunteers a list of made-up words and Chinese-like characters, some just once, some as many as 25 times. Then he asked, "Which ones do you like best?" The results were so lopsided they almost felt rigged. The more often a word or symbol had appeared, the more people said they liked it. It did not matter that the words were meaningless. It did not matter that the characters could have been insults or warnings. Familiarity alone was enough to make the brain lean in. This is the mere exposure effect. The mind's shortcut for safe is seen before. It is the same reason a song that annoyed you on first listen can, after a week of radio play, become the tune you hum in the shower. You do not remember deciding to like it. You just wake up one morning and realize you know every word. Advertisers have been running this play for decades. They do not need to convince you with logic or evidence. They just need to get the slogan in front of you enough times that it starts to feel like part of the landscape. Just do it. I'm loving it. Because you're worth it. These phrases do not win you over with argument. They win you over by repetition until the line between "I have seen this before" and "I have checked this before" quietly disappears. It gets stranger. In 2012, researchers found that when people read news headlines, stories with familiar-sounding names felt more credible, even when the stories were completely made up. The brain's filter for truth is not a fact checker. It is a bouncer at the door, waving in anything that looks like it has been here before. This is why political campaigns plaster the same name on every lawn sign, why brands repeat their jingles until you can recite them in your sleep, and why a familiar face in your social media feed feels more trustworthy than a stranger, even if you have never met either one. The mind is not weighing evidence. It is counting exposures. You are right to feel a little unnerved by this, because comfort can be manufactured. Trust can be faked. All it takes is enough repetition. The mind's shortcut for safe is not proven. It is familiar. And that shortcut is running in the background every time you scroll, every time you listen, every time you think you are making up your own mind. The punchline is not that you are gullible. The punchline is that everyone is. The mere exposure effect is not a bug in your reasoning. It is a feature. It is the reason you survived long enough to be here, listening to this. In a world where the unknown could be dangerous, the familiar was a good bet. But in a world where repetition is cheap, that same shortcut can be hijacked by anyone with a slogan and a budget. So the next time you find yourself humming a song you never liked, or nodding along to a headline that just feels right, remember, the mind often mistakes. I have seen this before, for I have checked this before. That is how the tune gets in your head. That is how the story starts to write itself. But repetition does something even more dangerous when it starts hardening random facts into a neat little story. Narrative fallacy. The story that arrives after the chaos. At 4:01 in the afternoon, the market closes. The anchors on the news set lean in, voices smooth, eyes bright. They tell you why the Nasdaq jumped nearly 3% in the last hour. They point to a Federal Reserve statement, a shift in oil prices, a rumor that started at 3:45. It all sounds inevitable, but rewind the tape to 3:59, and not one of them saw it coming. This is not a story about finance. It is about the mind's hunger for stories, and how that hunger can turn chaos into comfort. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, in his book Fooled by Randomness, called it the narrative fallacy. The mind stitches scattered facts into a pattern, then forgets the stitches ever existed. The explanation feels so right, so obvious, that you cannot remember a time when you did not believe it. It is not just the news. In 1944, Fritz Heider and Marianne Simmel showed people a short film of simple shapes, triangles, and circles moving around a screen. There was no plot, no dialogue, just motion. Yet almost everyone who watched it invented a story. The big triangle was a bully. The little circle was trying to escape. The shapes became characters, motives, a drama. The mind cannot help itself. It turns randomness into narrative, and narrative into meaning. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who spent decades studying these traps, has a phrase for this: what you see is all there is. The mind does not ask what is missing. It does not wonder about the data that never made it to the screen, or the causes that never left a trace. It takes the pieces in front of it and builds a story, then trusts the story more than the facts. Think of it like sorting through a box of old family photos. The pictures are out of order, some are missing, and half the faces are strangers. But you cannot leave them scattered. You start arranging them into an album. You invent connections, fill in gaps, decide who must have known whom. By the end, you have a family history that feels complete, even if it never really happened that way. The same thing happens every day on television, in boardrooms, in your own head. A stock moves, a relationship ends, a storm hits, and the story arrives after the chaos. The explanation is always waiting, always ready to make sense of what just happened. It feels good. It feels safe, but it is a comfort built on air. Taleb's warning is simple and brutal. Stories make the world feel more understandable than it really is. The more coherent the explanation, the more persuasive it becomes. Precisely because reality was never coherent enough to produce one. The mind prefers a neat fiction to a messy truth. That should bother you, because if you trust the story, you stop looking for the missing pieces. You stop asking how many times the same pattern was almost there, but never quite appeared. You forget that most of what happens in the world is noise, not signal. The most dangerous stories are the ones that ignore the coldest number in the room. How often something happens before your case ever appears. Base rate neglect, ignoring the background to chase the exception. You are a doctor. You have just told a patient their test came back positive. The test is 95% accurate. The disease is rare, 1 in 1,000. You feel the weight of the result. You brace yourself to deliver bad news. But here is the part that should make your stomach drop. The odds that your patient actually has the disease are not 95%. They are closer to 2%. That is not a typo. In 1978, Stephen Cassels and his colleagues at Harvard Medical School asked this exact question to doctors, residents, and students. Nearly half of them said the chance was 95% or higher. The real answer, calculated by Bayes' rule, is so much lower it feels like a trick. But it is not a trick. It is arithmetic, and it is merciless. Here is why. Imagine a jar with 1,000 beads. One bead is red, the disease. The other 999 are white. Now, you have a test that is 95% accurate. You reach in and pull out a bead. If it is red, the test almost always says positive. If it is white, the test still says positive 5% of the time. So you run the test on all 1,000 beads. You get one true positive, the red bead. But you also get about 50 false positives from the white beads. That is 51 positive results, but only one is real. The rest are ghosts. This is not just a math puzzle. In the real world, it means that most people who get a positive result from a rare disease test are not actually sick. In the 1990s, Gerd Gigerenzer started asking doctors and patients to think in terms of natural frequencies instead of percentages. He would say, out of 1,000 women, 10 will test positive, but only 1 will actually have the disease. Suddenly the fog would lift. The numbers became people. The dread became clear. Nowhere is this more brutal than in mammography for women under 50. The test is over 90% accurate, but breast cancer is rare in this group. For every 1,000 women screened, about 100 will get a positive result. Only 4 to 9 will actually have cancer. The rest will be told, sometimes for weeks, that they might have a deadly disease they do not have. The test is not broken. The arithmetic is just that cruel. Even trained physicians, people who have spent years in the company of numbers, routinely overestimate what a positive test means. The mind wants to chase the exception, the one red bead, because it feels urgent, vivid, and real. But the background, the base rate, is the silent majority. It is the jar itself. Bayes' rule is not a trick for statisticians. It is the only way to see through the fog of rare events and scary headlines. It is the reason rare things stay rare, even when the news makes them feel like a daily threat. That should bother you. Because if a test can sound almost perfect and still leave most positive results wrong, then intuition is not just unreliable. It is actively misleading in a room full of percentages. The dread is not in the disease, it is in the arithmetic. And once raw numbers become hard to feel, the mind commits a second crime. It stops caring how big the difference really is. Scope insensitivity. Why 2,000 dead birds and 2,000 dead birds feel weirdly similar. You are standing in front of a question that should be easy. How much would you pay to save 2,000 birds from drowning in oil ponds? Now, what about 20,000? What about 200,000? In 1993, a team led by William DeVuges ran this exact survey. The numbers are not a typo. The average person offered $80 to save 2,000 birds, $78 to save 20,000, and $88 to save 200,000. The scale of the disaster grew 100-fold. The compassion barely twitched. Paul Slovic has a name for this: psychic numbing. The mind's volume knob for empathy does not keep turning up as the numbers rise. It hits a point, then just sits there, no matter how much louder the suffering gets. You would think that more victims would mean more urgency, more pain, more action. But the opposite happens. The first story, the first image, the first face, those can move you. Add a second, a third, 1,000 more, and the feeling starts to flatten. Sometimes it even fades. It is not just birds. Slovic's research shows that people will give more to help a single named child than to a whole village. The identifiable victim effect. One face can break your heart. A stadium full of faces becomes a statistic. The mind was not built to feel in bulk. You might think this is just a quirk of surveys, a weirdness in how people answer questions about money. But it shows up everywhere. Charities know that a single photograph, a single name, will raise more than a spreadsheet of numbers. Policy support for disaster relief, for famine, for war, public giving, and political will both flatten out as the scale grows. The numbers get bigger. The emotional signal stays small. It is like a volume knob that stops turning after halfway. You can crank it all you want, but the music never gets any louder. The first note is thunder. The next 100 are just background. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of resolution. Human empathy was built for the village, the tribe, the face across the fire. It can scream for one, but it goes quiet in front of a stadium full of grief. That should bother you, because if your feelings cannot measure size, then the next question matters even more. What happens when feelings start deciding risk for you altogether? Affect heuristic. First feel, then pretend you reasoned. You are standing in a room with two new technologies. One is described in warm, glowing language. The other gets a list of ominous warnings. You have never seen either before, but within seconds your gut has already picked a favorite. Here is the weird part. If you are like most people, you will rate the one you like as safer and more useful, and the one you dislike as riskier and less valuable, even if the facts are identical. Paul Slovic, Melissa Finucane, Ellen Peters, and Donald McGregor spent the early 2000s running experiments that should make you question every rational opinion you have ever had about risk. They showed people technologies like nuclear power, pesticides, and food additives. When the description was positive, people saw low risk and high benefit. When the description was negative, the same technology suddenly looked dangerous and barely worth the trouble. The numbers did not change, only the emotional coloring did. This is the affect heuristic. It is the mind's habit of letting a feeling delight, dread, disgust do the heavy lifting before any real analysis begins. Slovic's team found that risk and benefit judgments are not just independent. They are inversely linked when feelings are strong. If you like something, you do not just rate it better. You literally rate it as less risky. If you dislike it, the risks balloon and the benefits shrink, all before you have even started to think about the details. It happens fast. The affect heuristic is not a slow, careful weighing of pros and cons. It is a snap judgment, a gut-level reaction that arrives before your mouth has even finished reading the label. Slovic's research showed that people often make up their minds about a technology or activity in a flash, then spend the next few minutes building arguments to defend that first impression. The reasoning comes after the feeling, not before. Think about how you decide if a restaurant is good. You walk in, catch a whiff of something delicious, and your mind is made up before you have even seen the menu. The smell is not a logical argument, but it colors everything that follows. The service seems friendlier, the food tastes better, and even the prices look more reasonable. The affect heuristic works the same way. The first feeling sets the stage, and every fact that follows gets filtered through that mood. In one of Slovic's studies, participants were asked to rate the risks and benefits of various technologies. When primed with positive feelings, they rated benefits higher and risks lower. When primed with negative feelings, the pattern flipped. This was true for nuclear power, pesticides, food additives, anything that could trigger a strong gut reaction. The effect was not subtle, it was immediate and powerful, and it did not care about the actual data. You are right to be a little disturbed by this, because it means that your opinions about what is safe, what is useful, and what is dangerous are often just echoes of your first emotional hit. The facts come later, if at all, and the more confident you feel, the more likely it is that your gut got there first and your brain is just playing catch-up. The punchline is simple and a little embarrassing. When we like something, we do not just rate it better. We literally rate it as less risky. The mind's shortcut for good and safe is often the same road, and it is paved with feelings, not facts. And once the gut picks a side, the mind's next move is not to test the idea, but to go looking for proof. Confirmation bias. The mind is a biased detective. You are handed a sequence, 2, 4, 6. The man across the table, Peter Wason, tells you there is a rule. Your job is to figure it out. You can propose any 3-number sequence, and he will tell you if it fits. Most people, when given this task in 1960, did exactly what you are about to do. They guessed 8, 10, 12. He nodded. They tried 20, 22, 24. Again, yes. The pattern seemed obvious. Numbers going up by 2. But here's the trick. Almost nobody tried to break their own idea. Almost nobody said, what about 3, 5, 7? Or what about 10, 9, 8? The actual rule was brutally simple. any ascending sequence. But the mind does not want to break its own story. It wants to confirm it. Wayson's experiment became famous because it revealed something embarrassing and universal. When we think we are investigating, we are really auditioning witnesses for our favorite theory. This is not a rare glitch. In Wayson's original study, fewer than 1 in 5 participants ever tried to disprove their guess. The rest kept stacking up confirming evidence, feeling more and more certain, never realizing they were building a case on sand. The term for this is confirmation bias. It is not a technical quirk. It is the default setting. You see it every day, but it hides in plain sight. You Google a question, and the first link that agrees with you feels like proof. You scroll through news feeds, and the stories that echo your beliefs get more clicks, more shares, more space in your mind. The algorithm is not evil. It is just efficient. It learns what you want to believe and serves it up, hotter and faster each time. The result is a world where your own opinions come back to you dressed as facts, and every search is a mirror. Think about how a lawyer works. Not a judge, not a scientist. A lawyer. The job is not to find the truth. The job is to build the strongest case for one side. You call witnesses who help, you ignore the ones who hurt, and you weave the evidence into a story that feels inevitable. Most people, most of the time, treat their beliefs this way. They do not ask, "Is this true?" They ask, "What would make this easier to keep believing?" It gets worse with intelligence. Smarter people are not less prone to confirmation bias. They are just better at finding clever reasons to defend what they already think. The mind becomes a high-powered attorney, not a detective. The more evidence you gather, the more you can cherry-pick, the more airtight your case feels. But airtight is not the same as accurate. This is why the scientific method exists. Not because scientists are less biased, but because they know they are. The whole machinery of experiments, peer review, and falsifiability is a desperate attempt to force the mind to look for disconfirming evidence. Karl Popper, in 1959, said that a theory is only scientific if it can be proven wrong. The point is not to win the case. The point is to risk losing it. You are right to feel a little exposed by this, because if you are honest, you will see it everywhere. In the way you argue, in the way you search, in the way you remember. Most people do not investigate beliefs. They audition witnesses for them. But confirmation bias still sounds almost innocent until you see what happens when identity itself starts hiring the evidence. Motivated. Reasoning intelligence as a defense attorney. You are looking at the same graph as someone else, but you are not seeing the same thing. You feel it in your chest the moment the numbers start to threaten your side. The data is right there, but your mind is already working the angles, searching for a way out. You are not alone. This is not a flaw in your character. This is the mind doing what it was built to do. Defend the tribe, protect the story, and keep you safe from the pain of being wrong in public. Dan Kahan at Yale spent years running experiments that should make you uncomfortable. In 2013, he gave people a set of numbers about a new skin cream. If the numbers were neutral, people with better math skills did better. But when the same numbers were about gun control or climate change, something twisted. The smarter you were with numbers, the more likely you were to get the answer wrong, if the right answer threatened your group. Higher numeracy did not make people more objective. It made them better at defending what they already needed to believe. Drew Weston, in 2006, put political partisans in an fMRI scanner and showed them evidence that their chosen candidate had contradicted himself. The reasoning centers of the brain stayed quiet. Instead, the emotional circuits lit up. The moment they found a way to dismiss the contradiction, the brain's reward system fired. It felt good to win the argument, even if the argument was with reality. Kahan calls this identity-protective cognition. The mind is not just a lawyer for your beliefs, it is a bodyguard for your group. When a fact threatens your tribe, your reasoning skills do not go to sleep. They go to work. They become a brilliant mechanic, tuning the engine to drive in circles, always returning you to the place you started. The more skilled you are, the tighter the circle. You have felt this. You have watched someone twist themselves into knots to defend the indefensible, and you have felt the heat rise in your own chest when your side is under attack. You are not immune. Intelligence is not a shield against this trap. It is often the shovel that digs you in deeper. Think about the last time you argued online. Did you really weigh the evidence, or did you go hunting for ammunition? Did you ever feel the strange satisfaction of finding a flaw in the other side's argument, even if it was beside the point? That is not reason. That is the bodyguard doing its job. The analogy is not abstract. It is domestic. It is the moment you catch yourself justifying a purchase you already made, inventing reasons after the fact. It is the friend who cannot admit the relationship is over, so they build a case for staying. The smarter they are, the more convincing the story becomes. The engine is running perfectly, but it is only driving in circles. Here is the inversion that should make you sit up. The people who are best at math, logic, and argument are often the ones who build the strongest cages around the beliefs they most need to protect. The mind does not want truth. It wants safety, belonging, and the feeling of being right in front of the people who matter. That should bother you. Because if intelligence can become a defense attorney for the tribe, then every argument is a trial where the verdict was decided before the evidence was ever heard. And once you have defended a belief long enough, the past itself starts quietly rewriting to make you look wiser than you were. Hindsight bias. The lie that history was obvious. The morning after a political upset, a market crash, or a sports final, the world wakes up with a strange new certainty. Suddenly, everyone remembers seeing it coming. The warning signs were obvious. The outcome, inevitable. You hear it on the news, at breakfast, in your own head. Of course it happened this way. How could anyone have missed it? But that feeling is a trick. In 1975, Baruch Fischoff ran a series of experiments that should make you question every memory you have of knowing it all along. Fischoff gave people the details of real historical events, wars, elections, medical cases, then told some of them how the story ended. He asked everyone to estimate how likely that outcome had seemed beforehand. The people who knew the ending did not just update their opinions. They rewrote their memories. They insisted the ending had always been the most likely result, even when the event was a total surprise at the time. This is hindsight bias. It is not just a quirk of memory. It is a full rewrite. Once you know the ending, your mind quietly edits the old diary pages. You remember yourself as more prescient, more cautious, or more skeptical than you really were. The breakup that blindsided you. In hindsight, you always saw it coming. The stock that tanked. I had a bad feeling about it. The underdog victory. I knew they had it in them. The past becomes a story that flatters the present self. Fischoff's experiments were not just about trivia. He found the same effect in places where judgment is supposed to be sharpest. Doctors, jurors, and financial analysts all became harsher after learning the outcome. A medical decision that looked reasonable before a bad result suddenly seemed reckless. A legal call that was defensible in the moment became, in retrospect, a clear mistake. The mind does not just update its beliefs. It retrofits the whole story to make the ending feel inevitable. That should bother you. Because if learning the outcome changes what you think you believed before, then memory is not a recording. It is a novelist, rewriting the plot to make the hero look wise, or the villain look obvious. The more dramatic the ending, the more the mind wants to believe it was always heading there. Think about it like this. Imagine you kept a diary during a relationship. After the breakup, you go back and reread your old entries. But now, every ambiguous moment, every small argument, every offhand comment gets a new meaning. You start to see signs you never noticed. You might even remember feeling doubts you never actually had. The diary did not change. Your story about it did. That is hindsight bias at work. The mind edits the past to make the present make sense. It gets stranger. Fischoff found that even when people are warned about hindsight bias, they still fall for it. You can know the trick is coming and still watch yourself perform it. The mind wants coherence more than accuracy. It wants to believe the world is explainable, that you are the kind of person who saw it coming, that chaos is just a puzzle you have already solved. This is not just about ego. It is about survival. If the past feels predictable, the future feels controllable. If you knew it all along, you can believe you will know it next time. But that is the lie. The truth is, most of what feels obvious in hindsight was invisible in the moment. The warning signs were only clear after the ending gave them meaning. So the next time you catch yourself saying, "I knew it," pause. Ask yourself what you really believed before the ending arrived. Ask yourself how many other outcomes would have felt just as inevitable if they had happened instead. Memory is not a courtroom witness. It is a novelist, and it is always writing for the audience of now. And if the ending can change what you remember, it can also change how you judge whether the decision itself was good. Outcome bias. Judging decisions. By luck in disguise. 2 surgeons, same hospital, same night. Both face the same impossible call. Operate now or wait for more tests. One patient lives, the other dies. By morning, the first surgeon is a hero, the second a cautionary tale. But here is the part that should make you uneasy. They made the same decision, with the same information. The only difference was luck. In 1988, Jonathan Barron and John Hershey ran an experiment that should have ended the debate forever. They gave people a medical scenario. A doctor chooses a risky treatment. Sometimes the patient survives, sometimes not. When the outcome was good, people called the decision wise. When the outcome was bad, they called it reckless. The facts never changed. Only the ending did. You are right to feel that is unfair, because it is. The mind wants to reward winners and punish losers, even when chance is doing most of the work. We do not just judge the process. We judge the result, then rewrite the story backward to make it look inevitable. Think about a card game. You watch someone bet big on a weak hand and win because the right card turns up. Suddenly, they are a genius. Next round, someone folds a strong hand, the river brings disaster, and now they are a coward. But you know the truth. The cards were dealt before anyone could see them. Judging the player by the outcome is like grading a chef by the weather on delivery day. This is not just a casino problem. In business, the executive who bets the company on a risky merger and gets lucky is celebrated as a visionary. The one who does everything by the book and loses to a market crash is blamed for incompetence. Phil Rosenzweig wrote about this in The Halo Effect. The story of the winner gets polished until it shines. The loser's story gets rewritten as a warning, even if the difference was a coin flip. Sports are even more brutal. Coaches are fired after a single unlucky loss, no matter how good their strategy. Michael Mauboussin calls this the success equation. A coach who wins on a fluke is a genius. A coach who loses on a bad bounce is an idiot. The process is invisible. The scoreboard is everything. Here is the part that should keep you up at night. A terrible decision with a lucky ending is often remembered as sound judgment, while a careful decision with bad luck gets written off as stupidity. The mind cannot help itself. It wants to see order, to believe that good things happen to good choices and bad things to bad ones. But the world is messier than that. Good process can lose. Bad process can win. On any given day, luck is wearing the mask of wisdom, which is exactly why our forecasts become fantasy so easily, because we imagine future success as if luck will politely cooperate. The planning fallacy. The calendar is always lying. You are standing in front of the Sydney Opera House, but it is 1959 and the sales are still just sketches on a page. The government promises it will take 4 years. 7 million Australian dollars. A marvel, delivered on time, on budget, and ready for the world. You can almost hear the optimism echoing off the empty harbor. 14 years later, the building finally opens. The final bill is $102 million. The project has eaten through 5 prime ministers, 3 architects, and a generation's worth of patience. The joke in Sydney is that the only thing finished on time was the sign announcing the delay. This is not a story about bad luck or a single disastrous decision. It is the most famous example of a trap that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky named in 1979. The planning fallacy. The mind's ability to look straight at a calendar, remember every missed deadline, and still say, "This time will be different." Kahneman tells a story in Thinking Fast and Slow that should make you wince. He and a team of academics were designing a new high school curriculum. They were experts. They had done this before. When asked how long it would take, the group guessed between 18 and 30 months. Then someone suggested taking the outside view, looking at how long similar projects had taken. The answer was 7 to 10 years. They laughed. They ignored it. 8 years later, the project was abandoned, unfinished. That makes no sense. And you are right to be disturbed by it, because these were not amateurs. They were people who had seen the trap, named the trap, and still fell in with both feet. The planning fallacy is not just optimism, it is a kind of amnesia. You pack for a trip in 10 minutes, every time, and every time you forget the charger. You tell yourself the next essay, the next renovation, the next product launch will be the one that finally runs on schedule. You know the history. You just quietly decide it does not apply to you. Kahneman and Tversky called this the inside view. When you make a plan, you picture the steps, the milestones, the best-case scenario. The outside view is colder. It asks, how did this go for people like you last time? The inside view is a daydream. The outside view is a ledger. Here is the inversion. The more you know about the trap, the more creative your excuses become. You remember every overrun, every blown budget, and still you carve out a little exception for yourself. This time, we have better tools. This time, the team is different. This time, I have learned. The calendar is always lying, but you keep listening. The Sydney Opera House is not just a building. It is a monument to the stories we tell ourselves about the future. Every time you promise to finish by Friday, every time you believe a project will cost what the spreadsheet says, you are standing on those white sails, looking out at a harbor full of ghosts. He figured it out in 1979. The world keeps proving him right. And our overconfidence survives, because we often understand far less than we think we do in the first place. Illusion of explanatory depth. The toilet test for confidence. How does a flush toilet work? Not in general. Not you push the handle and it goes away. I mean, if I handed you a pencil and a napkin right now, could you draw the steps? Where does the water go first? What makes the bowl refill? What stops the tank from overflowing? Try it, just for a second. You can feel the confidence start to slip, can't you? It is like reaching for a word you were sure you knew and finding nothing but air. Leonid Rosenblatt and Frank Kyle at Yale ran this exact experiment in 2002. They called it the illusion of explanatory depth. They would ask people how well they understood something ordinary, a zipper, a bicycle, a toilet. Most people gave themselves a solid 7 or 8 out of 10. Then came the real test. Explain it, step by step. Suddenly the numbers collapsed. People who had just been brimming with confidence now stared at the page, realizing they could not get past the first move. The drop was not subtle. It was a cliff. It is not just toilets. Try a zipper. You have zipped up a jacket 1,000 times, but if someone asked you to explain how the teeth lock together, you would probably wave your hands and hope they change the subject. The same thing happens with bicycles, ballpoint pens, even the humble can opener. The more familiar the object, the more invisible its workings become. We are surrounded by explanations, so we start to believe we actually possess them. Rosenblatt and Kyle's studies did not stop at gadgets. They found the same effect with political opinions. Ask someone how a new tax policy works, and they will sound certain until you ask them to walk through the details. Suddenly, the edges blur. The confidence drains out. People who thought they were sure become more moderate, less extreme, just from the act of trying to explain. It is like knowing the route home, but not the names of the streets. You can get there, no problem, but if someone asks you to write directions for a stranger, you would realize how much you have been running on autopilot. The knowledge is there, but it is not yours in the way you thought. It is borrowed from the world, not built inside your head. This is not a rare glitch. It is the default setting. The mind is built to use what works and move on. If you had to explain every object before you trusted it, you would never leave the house. But the cost is that we walk around with a sense of mastery that is paper thin. We mistake the ability to use something for the ability to explain it. We confuse being surrounded by an explanation with actually possessing one. And when an idea feels easy to process, the brain often mistakes that smoothness for truth. Processing fluency. If it feels smooth, it must be right. If the rhyme fits, the mind commits. That is not just a clever line, it is a trapdoor in your head. In 2000, Matthew McGlone and Jessica Tofik-Baksh ran an experiment with proverbs. They handed people two versions of the same idea. Woes unite foes versus woes unite enemies. The first one rhymes. The second one does not. The meaning is identical. But the rhyming version was judged truer, wiser, more reliable. The only thing that changed was the music of the words. This is not a quirk, it is a feature. The brain is built to treat ease as evidence. If a sentence glides, it feels like it must be right. If it stumbles, it feels suspect. Adam Alter and Daniel Oppenheimer in 2005 showed that even the font matters. Give people a statement in a crisp, easy-to-read typeface, and they are more likely to believe it. Make the font jagged or faint, and suddenly the same words feel less true. The logic has not changed, only the smoothness. It gets weirder. In 1977, Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Tapino discovered the illusory truth effect. Repeat a statement often enough, and people start to believe it, even if they know it is false. The mind confuses familiarity with accuracy. I have heard this before becomes I have checked this before. The more times a claim circles back, the more it feels like a fact. You are not immune. Nobody is. The effect is so strong that even experts, even skeptics, start to lean toward the smooth, the familiar, the polished. Stanford's Web Credibility Project found that people rate websites as more trustworthy when the design is clean, the graphics are professional, and the layout is easy to follow. The content could be nonsense. The confidence is in the packaging. It is like buying a gadget in a glossy box. The shine, the weight, the satisfying click of the lid. These things whisper quality before you ever see what is inside. You trust the product because the box feels expensive. You trust the sentence because it rhymes, or repeats, or glides across your tongue. The mind is not checking the logic, it is checking the feeling. Think about slogans. If the glove does not fit, you must acquit. That line did more work in a courtroom than 100 pages of evidence. It rhymed. It stuck. It felt true. Or take the old advertising trick. Red Bull gives you wings. Nobody believes it literally, but the rhythm and repetition make it feel like a promise. The mind is not built to resist this. It is built to enjoy it. This is how misinformation spreads. Not with complexity, but with fluency. A simple, catchy phrase can outcompete a careful, accurate explanation. The more polished the delivery, the more dangerous the lie. The mind rewards what is easy to process, not what is hard to verify. You are right to feel uneasy, because this is not just about slogans or proverbs. It is about every decision you make when the surface feels smooth. The job candidate with the slick resume, the politician with the practiced speech, the news story that just sounds right. The mind is grading the box, not the contents. And the worst part is, the more confident the delivery, the more invisible the trick. You do not notice the rhyme. You do not notice the font. You just feel the truth sliding in, unchallenged. A sentence can gain credibility from rhyme and readability alone, even when its logic stays exactly the same. That is the charm of fluency. That is the danger. And once confidence gets separated from correctness, entire histories can be written around the people who happen to survive long enough to tell them. Survivorship bias. Learning from the people who made it through. You are in a briefing room in 1943. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of pencils scratching on blueprints. Engineers are arguing over where to add armor to the bombers coming back from missions over Europe. The wings are riddled with holes. The tail sections look like Swiss cheese. The fuselage is peppered with scars. The answer seems obvious. Reinforce the places that took the most hits. Then Abraham Wald, a Hungarian mathematician working with a statistical research group at Columbia, stands up. He points not to the bullet holes, but to the untouched spaces, the places with no damage at all. Wald tells the room, "You are looking at the wrong data. These are the planes that survived, the ones that made it back. The holes you see are the wounds a bomber can take and still limp home. The missing data, the planes that never returned, were likely hit in the places that look safest on these diagrams. The engines, the cockpit, the fuel lines. Armor those." That is the moment the room goes quiet, because Wald is not just talking about airplanes. He is talking about every story you have ever heard about success. Survivorship bias is the name for what happens when you only count the winners. When you read restaurant reviews, you are hearing from people who still had an appetite. The ones who got food poisoning, who left before dessert, who never came back. They are silent. Their stories do not show up in the data. The same thing happens with businesses, with artists, with investors. The failures vanish. The survivors write the history. It feels like wisdom to study the habits of billionaires, the routines of Olympic athletes, the quirks of the startups that made it. But the most important data in any system is often the part that never comes back to be counted. The failed companies, the unpublished novels, the investments that quietly went to zero. They leave no trace except in the empty spaces of the record. Startup culture is built on this silence. Every year, thousands of founders launch companies with the same optimism, the same hustle, the same advice from the same books. A handful make it. Their stories become gospel. The rest disappear, and nobody writes their post-mortem. Self-help books are written by the people who succeeded, not by the ones who did everything right and still lost. The advice you hear is filtered through the survivors. It is like trying to learn about the ocean by studying only the ships that made it to port. You miss the reefs, the storms, the invisible currents that pulled the others under. You start to believe that success is just a matter of following the right steps, when in reality, the steps are only visible because someone happened to survive them. Wald's insight was elegant because it was so easy to miss. The absence is the clue. The missing data is the message. The most important lessons are often hiding in the stories that never get told, and sometimes the sample is not just incomplete. By accident, it is crooked from the moment it is collected. Selection bias. The poll that chose its voters. The Literary Digest was not some crank newsletter. In 1936, it was the polling heavyweight of America. They mailed out 10 million ballots, more than the population of some countries, and over 2 million people sent them back. The Digest's prediction was delivered with the confidence of a thunderclap. Alf Landon would crush Franklin Roosevelt in the presidential election. The numbers were so big, so precise, so overwhelming, that even the skeptics had to pause. 2 million responses. How could that possibly be wrong? But the ballots had been sent to names pulled from telephone directories and automobile registrations. In the middle of the Great Depression, owning a phone or a car was not just a convenience, it was a class marker. The Digest's sample was not America. It was the slice of America that could still afford a dial tone and a set of wheels, while bread lines stretched around city blocks. The poll was measuring the country with a ruler that was bent, but it measured with such care, such precision, that nobody noticed the warp until the results came in. Election night arrived. Alf Landon did not win. He did not even come close. Franklin Roosevelt swept the country in one of the most lopsided victories in American history. The Digest's poll was not just wrong, it was spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong. The magazine never recovered. Its reputation, built on the promise that more data meant more truth, collapsed in a single night. Meanwhile, a quieter figure named George Gallup had been running his own poll. Gallup's sample was tiny by comparison, but it was built on a different principle: representation over raw numbers. He went out of his way to find people who looked like the country, not just the ones who could afford a phone call. Gallup predicted Roosevelt's victory almost exactly. The lesson was brutal and simple. A small, honest sample can beat a giant biased one, because precision cannot rescue a crooked doorway. It is the kind of mistake that feels too obvious to repeat, but the world keeps finding new ways to do it. Today, online polls and platform data promise to read the mood of millions in real time. But who is answering? Who is even seeing the question? The people who click? The people who post? The people who have the time and the temperament to respond? These are not the silent majority. They are the self-selected, the visible tip of a much larger, quieter iceberg. The sample is still bent, only now the numbers are even bigger and the confidence even louder. It is like measuring your living room with a ruler you know is warped. You can measure it 1,000 times, to the millimeter, and the answer will always be wrong in the same direction. The error is not in the counting. It is in the doorway you walked through to start. That is why the most impressive numbers can sometimes be the most dangerous. They do not just mislead, they seduce. They make you feel that certainty is a function of scale, that enough data can drown out any doubt. But if the sample is crooked, the whole story bends with it. But even with a fair sample, the next trap waits inside us. We explain other people by character, and ourselves by circumstance. Fundamental attribution error: character for them, context for me. You are reading a stack of essays about Fidel Castro. Some are pro, some are anti. You have been told, in plain language, that the writers did not choose their side. The positions were assigned. Still, as you read, you cannot help it. The words feel like windows into the writer's soul. The pro-Castro essayist must be a true believer. The anti-Castro writer must be a hardliner. You know, rationally, that the assignment was random, but the feeling is stubborn. This is not a hypothetical. In 1967, Edward Jones and Victor Harris ran this exact experiment at Duke University. They found that even when people knew the writers had no choice, they still read deep conviction into the words. The mind wants to see character, not circumstance. This is the fundamental attribution error, sometimes called correspondence bias. It is the reflex to explain other people's actions by their personality, their beliefs, their core, and to quietly ignore the situation they are in. You see a driver cut you off and think, what a jerk. You forget that maybe they are late for a job interview, or their kid is sick in the back seat. But when you cut someone off, you have a whole story ready. You were distracted. You were tired. You were under pressure. The same move, two different explanations. One is a biography, the other is a weather report. It happens at work. The colleague misses a deadline, and you think she is lazy. You miss a deadline and think this week was chaos. In parenting, it is even sharper. A child throws a tantrum, and you wonder what is wrong with them. You lose your temper and blame the day, the noise, the lack of sleep. The spotlight is always on them. For you, the lighting is soft, forgiving. It is not just a quirk. It is a pattern so deep that it shapes how we judge strangers, friends, even public figures. In the Castro essay study, the facts were right there. The writers had no choice. Still, readers could not help but see belief leaking through the page. The same thing happens in road rage, in workplace reviews, in the way parents judge their kids. We are built to see other people's actions as a map of their character, and our own as a map of the weather we happened to be driving through. Think about the last time someone snapped at you. Did you imagine what might have been happening in their day? Or did you just decide they were rude? Now flip it. The last time you snapped at someone, did you feel misunderstood? Did you wish they could see the pressure you were under? This is the trap. We are all starring in our own movie, with the camera close on our face. Everyone else is just a character in the background, their motives guessed at from a distance. It is like living in a house with two kinds of lighting. For everyone else, the bulbs are harsh, every flaw exposed. For you, the lights are warm, the shadows gentle, the mood forgiving. You see your own context. You see their character. The punchline is not that we are hypocrites. It is that the mind is built to do this. It is easier, faster, and more comfortable to read personality into a moment than to imagine the 1,000 invisible pressures shaping someone else's day. That is why the same mistake looks like a moral failing in a stranger and a forgivable slip in yourself. We treat other people's behavior like biography and our own like circumstance reports. And because we protect our own image so fiercely, the next bias turns every success into proof of talent and every failure into weather. Self-serving bias. The ego's public relations department. You walk out of the exam room, heart pounding, and the grade lands in your hand. If it is an A, you feel a private surge of pride. You earned this. You worked for it. If it is a C, the story shifts. The test was unfair. The questions were worded badly. The teacher never explained that chapter. The mind does not even pause to notice the switch. It just happens, as smoothly as a mirror tilting to catch your best angle. This is not a student thing. It is a human thing. In 1975, psychologists Dale Miller and Michael Ross combed through study after study and found the same pattern everywhere they looked. Students who aced the test credited their ability and effort. Students who stumbled pointed to the weather, the teacher, the questions, the room. The same mind, the same event. Two stories. One for pride, one for pain. It is not just classrooms. Watch a post-game interview. The winning athlete thanks their training, their focus, their heart. The loser blames the ref, the field, the wind, the flu. In 1980, Edward Lau and Russell Russell cataloged this in sports. Wins are personal, losses are circumstantial. The pattern repeats in boardrooms and trading floors. Executives and investors, when things go right, see the proof of their vision. When things go wrong, it is the market, the economy, the unpredictable. Hayward, Shepard, and Griffin found this in 2006, tracing the same dance through corporate decisions and failed investments. The self-serving bias is not a bug, it is a feature. It is the ego's public relations department, working overtime, spinning every outcome to protect the fragile self from humiliation. It is not just about feeling good, it is about survival. If every failure is a personal flaw, the weight becomes unbearable. So the mind builds a story where the wins are yours and the losses are someone else's mess. But here is the trick. The more convincing the story, the less you learn. If every mistake is someone else's fault, the lesson slides off like rain on waxed paint. The feedback loop breaks. You walk away from the meeting, the trade, the exam, and nothing changes except your certainty that you were right all along. The mirror is still there, angled just so, showing you the version of yourself you most want to see. Think about it in your own life. The last time something went wrong, how fast did your mind reach for the nearest excuse? How quickly did it find a reason that let you keep your pride intact? It feels good. It feels safe. But it is a safety that costs you the chance to see what actually happened, to grow, to change. Many of the stories we tell about growth are actually stories about avoiding humiliation. We rewrite the past to keep the self unbruised. We call it learning, but often it is just the ego quietly editing the record. And when confidence gets fed without correction, The next trap appears almost inevitably: not knowing how much you do not know. Dunning-Kruger. The skill you need to notice the skill you lack. You are sitting in a classroom at Cornell in 1999, staring at a test you just finished. You feel pretty good about it. Maybe not perfect, but solid. Around you, dozens of other students are doing the same mental math, quietly ranking themselves. Justin Kruger and David Dunning, the two psychologists running this experiment, are watching something strange unfold. When the scores come back, the students who performed the worst, those in the bottom quarter, are the ones most convinced they did well. Not just a little off, wildly, stubbornly, confidently wrong. This is not a story about dumb people. It is a story about the mind's blind spot for its own blind spots. Kruger and Dunning's study, published in 1999, found that the people least skilled at a task are often the least able to recognize their own mistakes. The same lack of skill that makes you miss the right answer also makes you miss the fact that you missed it. It is a double burden. You do not know, and you do not know that you do not know. Think about trying to measure a table with a rubber ruler that stretches every time you press down. You get a number, but the tool itself is lying to you. The less you know about how rulers work, the less likely you are to notice the problem. That is what self-evaluation feels like when you are out of your depth. The mind hands you a number and you trust it because you have no way to check the ruler. Kruger and Dunning's Cornell students were not just off by a little. The bottom quartile dramatically overestimated their performance, sometimes placing themselves above average when they were nowhere close. The cruel twist is that the skill you need to do well is the same skill you need to judge how well you did. Metacognition. The ability to step outside yourself and see your own thinking turns out to be a skill like any other. If you lack it, you cannot see the gap. And it gets weirder. The people at the top, the real experts, often make a different mistake. They underestimate how unusual their competence is. They assume that if something feels easy for them, it must be easy for everyone. This is sometimes called the curse of knowledge. The expert's silence is not humility. It is the quiet shock of realizing that what is obvious to you is invisible to most. You are right to feel uneasy about this, because it means that confidence is not a reliable signal of competence. In fact, it can be the opposite. The loudest certainty often comes from the people least equipped to notice their own errors. The real experts, the ones you want to trust, are often the ones who sound the least sure. It is not just a classroom problem. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows up everywhere, in business meetings, in politics, in arguments with friends. The person who knows the least about a subject is often the one most eager to explain it to you. The person who knows the most is often the one who hesitates, who qualifies, who says, "I am not sure." But this is not a story about intelligence. It is a story about the limits of self-audit. The mind is not built to see its own edges. It is built to move forward, to act, to defend its conclusions. The skill you need to notice your own incompetence is, cruelly, the very skill you lack when you are most in need of it. And the confidence gap widens further when you believe you are not biased at all, only more clear-eyed than everyone else. Naive realism: I see reality, you see politics. You can put two people in the same room, point them at the same event, and still end up with two completely different stories about what just happened. In 1951, psychologists Albert Hastorf and Hadley Cantrell did exactly that. They took students from Princeton and Dartmouth, sat them down in front of the same film of a brutal football game between their schools, and asked them to count the infractions. The results were not just a little off. Princeton students saw twice as many dirty plays by Dartmouth as by Princeton. Dartmouth students saw the reverse. Each side was convinced they were just calling it like they saw it. No one thought they were being biased. They thought they were being accurate. This is not just about football. Lee Ross, a psychologist at Stanford, gave this trick a name in the 1990s: naive realism. It is the belief that you see the world as it really is, and that anyone who disagrees must be ignorant, irrational, or just plain dishonest. Ross and his colleagues ran experiments where people read the same evidence about hot-button issues, affirmative action, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you name it. Each group walked away more convinced that the facts were on their side and that the other side was hopelessly biased. It feels so reasonable. You are not being stubborn, you are just seeing what is there. The other person is the one with the agenda. But here is the unsettling part. Both sides are doing this at the same time. Both are honestly filtering reality through different social lenses, and both are sure the other side is the one distorting things. Think about it like this. Imagine two people describing the same room, but one is standing in the corner by the window, and the other is by the door. The first person says, "This room is bright and open." The second says, "No, it is cramped and shadowy." They are both right from where they are standing. But if you only trust your own corner, you start to think the other person must be lying or blind. This is how political arguments get so bitter so fast. It is not just that people disagree about the facts. It is that each side believes their view is just common sense, and that anyone who cannot see it must be willfully ignoring reality. Lee Ross found that this effect gets even stronger when group identity is on the line. The more you care about your side, the more obvious it feels that you are just seeing things as they are. And here is the punchline. Conflict does not always come from people lying about what they saw. It often comes from people honestly believing their own perspective is the only one that counts as reality. That is why disagreement so easily feels like a moral failure, not just a difference of opinion. And once you assume your view is just common sense, you begin imagining that most sane people already agree with you. False consensus. Why your private view starts looking like common sense. You are standing in the middle of Stanford's campus in 1977, and someone hands you a sandwich board. It says, "Eat at Joe's." Would you wear it? That is the only question. No trick, no hidden camera, just a simple dare parade around with a sign for a place you probably do not even eat. Now, here is where it gets weird. After you make your choice, yes, I will wear the sign, or no, I absolutely will not, the researchers ask you a second question. How many of your fellow students do you think would make the same choice? And suddenly, the room fills with invisible people who look suspiciously like you. This is the false consensus effect. Lee Ross, David Green, and Pamela House ran this experiment at Stanford. The students who agreed to wear the sign guessed that about 62% of their peers would also agree. The ones who refused guessed only 33% would say yes. Both groups were wrong, and both groups were wrong in the same direction. They thought their private decision was the common sense answer. It is not just about sandwich boards. The same pattern shows up in politics, in health, in what you think is funny, in what you think is unforgivable. The moment you make a choice, your mind starts inflating the number of reasonable people who must have made it too. It is like stepping into a room and hearing your own voice come back as a crowd. You do not just believe you are right, you believe you are normal. And the effect is not small. In the original experiment, the actual number of students willing to wear the sign was much lower than either group guessed. But the mind does not care. Once you have chosen, it is as if the world quietly rearranges itself to make your choice look like the obvious one. Think about the last time you argued online. Maybe you posted something you thought was just common sense, and within minutes, the replies split into two camps. Those who agreed, and those who seemed to be living on another planet. The more you see your own view echoed back, the more it feels like the majority. But that is not consensus. That is the algorithm at work, curating a feed that makes your private taste look like public reality. It is the same trick, just with more pixels. Social media does not just show you what you like. It shows you what people like, you like. The result is a hall of mirrors, each reflection a little more certain that its own opinion is the baseline for sanity. Fringe ideas can start to feel mainstream. Minority tastes can look like the new normal. And all the while, the real numbers outside the bubble barely move. The domestic version of this is almost too familiar. You're at dinner, and you say something you think is obvious. Maybe it is about how to load the dishwasher, or what counts as being on time. You look around, expecting nods, And instead, you get blank stares or raised eyebrows. For a second, you wonder if you have slipped into a parallel universe. But the truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. Your private view is not the world's default setting. It is just yours, dressed up as common sense by a brain that cannot help itself. That should make you uneasy. Because if your mind is this quick to turn a personal choice into a public norm, how many of your other beliefs are just echoes in a room you did not realize was empty? How many times have you mistaken the comfort of agreement for the reality of consensus? The punchline is not that people are self-centered or arrogant. It is that the mind is built to avoid the loneliness of being an outlier. It wants to believe that the path it chose is the path most people would choose, if only they were honest or smart or paying attention. And in a world where every feed, every group chat, every curated timeline can amplify that illusion, the danger is not just being wrong. It is being wrong together, loudly, with confidence. And the mirror gets stranger when you know something well enough that you can no longer imagine what it feels like not to know it. The curse of knowledge, the tapping that never sounds like a song. Elizabeth Newton sat at Stanford in 1990, watching a parade of confident tappers drum out the rhythm to Happy Birthday on a table. The tappers were sure the listeners would get it. How could they not? The melody was obvious, the beat unmistakable. Newton asked the tappers to guess how often the listeners would name the song. They said about half the time. The real number was closer to 1 in 40. The listeners just stared back, lost. The tappers could not believe it. They had the whole song in their heads, every note filling in the gaps between the taps. But the listeners only heard a flat, cryptic pattern. The difference was not in intelligence or effort. It was in what each person could not unknow. This is the curse of knowledge. Once you know the song, you cannot hear the taps the way a stranger hears them anymore. The melody is so loud in your mind that you forget what it is like to be outside the music. It is like trying to explain color to someone through a keyhole. You see the whole room, the sunlight, the red chair, the blue vase. But the person on the other side only sees a sliver of light, a flicker of movement. You keep saying, "Can't you see it?" But they cannot. Not because they are slow, but because you have forgotten what it is like to see so little. This is not just a party trick or a lab experiment. The curse of knowledge is everywhere. Teachers skip steps that students still need. Managers give instructions that make perfect sense to them and no sense to anyone else. Designers build products that feel obvious, if you already know the trick. In every argument, every lesson, every meeting, the person with the answer forgets what it felt like to be lost. It gets worse. Once you know the answer, it is almost impossible to remember what it felt like not to know. You cannot forecast confusion. You cannot empathize with ignorance. You start to think, if I can see it, why can't they? The loneliness of knowledge is not just that you know something others do not. It is that you forget what it was like to be on the outside, guessing. This is why experts so often sound impatient, why instructions from the top floor feel like riddles, why the best teachers are the ones who remember what it was like to be a beginner. The curse of knowledge is not arrogance. It is amnesia. You do not remember what you have forgotten. And when your identity and effort are already sunk into a choice, forgotten alternatives become even harder to hear. Sunk cost fallacy. Paying again for yesterday's mistake. The Concorde was beautiful. That is the first thing people say. The nose that dipped, the delta wings, the way it sliced the Atlantic in 3 hours and change. But beauty is not the same as sense, and by the late 1970s, the numbers behind the Concorde had started to rot. The British and French governments had poured in billions. The airlines could not fill the seats. The fuel crisis hit. The world changed. But the project did not stop. It kept flying, kept burning money, kept pretending that the next year would be the one when the math finally worked out. The last Concorde landed in 2003, nearly 30 years after its first commercial flight, and decades after everyone involved knew the economics were a fantasy. This is the sunk cost fallacy, and it is not just a government problem. Hal Arches and Catherine Bloomer ran the numbers in 1985, but you do not need a lab to see it. You have lived it. You have sat in a movie theater, halfway through a film you hate, and told yourself to stay because you already paid for the ticket. You have finished a terrible meal because you ordered it, and the money is gone, and leaving would make the loss feel real. You have stayed in jobs, relationships, projects, and plans that stopped making sense long ago because walking away would mean admitting the price was already paid. The pain of admitting a loss is not a small thing. It is a physical ache, a tightening in the chest, a voice that says if you just keep going, maybe the story will turn out differently. Arches and Bloomer found that people will throw good money after bad, not because they believe in the future, but because they cannot bear to let the past be wasted. The more you have invested money, time, reputation, hope, the harder it is to see the exit. The harder it is to say, that was a mistake. I am done. It is not just money. Sunk costs come in every currency the mind can spend. Hours you will never get back. Status you fought to earn. Emotional labor you poured in when nobody else would. Every one of those investments becomes a hook in the flesh, pulling you forward even when the road ahead is a cliff. Rationally, none of it should matter. The only thing that counts is what happens next. If the future payoff is not worth the next dollar, the next hour, the next ounce of effort, you should walk away. That is what the textbooks say. But the textbooks do not have to sit with the feeling of waste. They do not have to explain to friends, to bosses, to themselves, why all that effort led to nothing. So people stay. They keep eating the meal that makes them sick. They keep flying the plane that cannot pay for its own fuel. They keep hoping that one more push will redeem the story. The Concorde is just the public version of a private agony. Every adult knows the moment, the spreadsheet that will never balance, the apology that will never come, the dream that will not wake up. The world is full of projects that should have ended years ago, kept alive by the fear that stopping would make the loss real. The real cost is not the money or the time. It is the years spent defending a decision that cannot be saved. You are right to feel the weight of this. Most of adult life is not about making perfect choices. It is about deciding when to stop paying for yesterday's mistake. The mind is built to protect the story of the first decision, even if it means paying again and again. And once institutions get trapped by sunk costs, they often do something worse than stay the course. They double down. Escalation of commitment, digging deeper. After hearing the hollow sound, think of the last time you argued for something you knew, deep down, was already lost. Not just a little lost. The kind of lost where the evidence is piling up, the room is getting quieter, and you can feel the ground shifting under your feet. Maybe it was a relationship you defended to your friends long after the laughter had turned nervous. Maybe it was a business plan, a political stance, a belief you had already mortgaged your pride to defend. The moment you realize you are not just wrong, you are invested in being wrong. Barry Staw saw this happen in boardrooms and battlefields. In 1976, he gave it a name, Escalation of Commitment. He watched as people, especially those who had made their choices in public, started pouring more resources, more time, more of themselves into a failing cause. Not because the facts had changed, but because the cost of admitting defeat had become unbearable. The more you say it out loud, the more you need it to be true. Quaker Oats, 1994. They buy Snapple for $1.7 billion. The numbers are wild even before the ink dries. By 1997, they are forced to sell for about $300 million. That is a loss of over $1 billion in 3 years. But the strangest part is not the loss. It is the way executives kept doubling down, more marketing, more distribution, more meetings long, after it was clear the deal was a disaster. They were not just defending a business decision, they were defending themselves. The Vietnam War. Every year, more troops, more money, more speeches about turning the corner. Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, described how leaders kept escalating, not because they believed in victory, but because the alternative, admitting it was all for nothing, was unthinkable. The sunk costs were not just dollars and lives, they were reputations, careers, entire worldviews. To back out would have been to say, "We were wrong, and we kept being wrong, and we told you to believe us anyway." You might think this is about politicians and CEOs. It is not. It is about you, and me, and the way the mind works when pride is on the line. The moment you tell the world what you believe, the cost of changing your mind goes up. Every public commitment is a brick in the wall you will have to tear down, stone by stone, if you ever want to leave. The more you invest, the more you need the story to end well, even if it means rewriting what well means. It is like digging a hole in your backyard. At first, you are just looking for something you lost, but the longer you dig, the more you need to find it. Neighbors start watching. You tell them you are close. You dig faster, deeper, even when the dirt is just dirt. Because climbing out now would mean admitting you wasted your time, your energy, your credibility. So you keep digging, hoping the next shovelful will justify all the ones before. This is not just a quirk. It is a trap. Barry Staw showed that public commitment makes it worse. Once you have staked your reputation, your identity, your sense of self on a decision, retreat feels like death. Correction is not just a change of course. It is a kind of self-annihilation. That is why people become most loyal to a bad decision at the precise moment it becomes hardest to defend. You are right to feel uncomfortable. Because if you have ever found yourself arguing harder as the evidence turns against you, you are not alone. The mind is built to protect itself, even if it means digging deeper into the hole. And the reason retreat hurts so much is simple. Losing weighs more heavily on the mind than winning. Loss aversion. Why the mind hates losing more than it loves winning. You are offered a bet. Flip a coin. If it lands heads, you win $100. If it lands tails, you lose $80. Most people say no. The math says yes. But the gut says no so fast you barely hear the numbers. This is not caution. This is not wisdom. This is the mind's ancient alarm system, blaring at the thought of loss. In 1979, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky ran the numbers and found something wild. Losing hurts about twice as much as winning feels good. They called it loss aversion, and it is not a quirk, it is a law. Prospect theory, they named it. The mind does not weigh gains and losses on the same scale. It uses a crooked ruler, one that stretches pain and shrinks reward. You can see it in the smallest things. In 1989, Jack Netsch at Simon Fraser University handed out coffee mugs to half a group of students. The other half got nothing. Then he asked, "How much would you pay to buy a mug? How much would you need to sell one?" The sellers wanted about twice as much as the buyers would pay. The only difference was who already had the mug. The moment it became theirs, losing it felt like a wound. It is the same with stocks. Investors cling to losing shares, waiting for them to come back, because selling would mean locking in a loss. They pass up better opportunities, all to avoid the sting of admitting defeat. In negotiations, people reject good deals if it means giving up something they already counted as theirs. In careers, people stay in jobs that drain them, because leaving would mean the years spent were wasted. The math is clear. The mind does not care. It is like protecting a chipped cup as if it were fine china. You know it is not worth much, but the thought of losing it, of having less than you started with, feels wrong in a way that is hard to explain. You would rather keep the cup, cracks and all, than risk the emptiness of letting it go. This is not just about money. It is about how the mind keeps score. Every loss is a headline. Every gain is a footnote. The brain is not built to maximize happiness. It is built to avoid regret, to dodge pain, to keep what it has even when what it has is not worth keeping. You are right to feel uneasy about this, because it means much of what passes for prudence is just the mind's lopsided accounting. The fear of loss is not a signal of danger. It is a signal of how easily the scales can tip. And once avoiding loss becomes the hidden goal, the default option starts looking safer than it really is. Status quo bias. The default option wearing a halo. You are handed a form. Maybe it is for your pension, or your health insurance, or the organ donor registry. There is a box already checked. You pause, pen hovering, and for a moment you wonder if someone smarter than you picked that option. You are not alone. Most people, when faced with a default, do not just accept it. They treat it as a kind of silent advice. In 1988, William Samuelson and Richard Zeckhauser ran a series of experiments that would give this phenomenon a name: status quo bias. They found that when people were offered a set of investment choices, the majority stuck with the pre-selected option, even when the alternatives were objectively better. The default was not just a starting point, it became a destination. This is not a quirk of paperwork, it is a force that shapes lives. In Austria and Belgium, organ donation is the default. You are a donor unless you say otherwise. The result? Consent rates above 90%. Cross the border to Germany or Denmark, where you must opt in, and the rates collapse below 20%. The only difference is which box is checked when the form lands in your lap. Retirement savings tell the same story. In the United States, companies that switched to automatic 401(k) enrollment saw participation rates leap from 60% to over 90%. No new incentives, no new education, just a new default. The money started flowing into savings not because people changed their minds, but because the path of least resistance changed direction. Why does this work? Part inertia, part risk aversion, part something deeper. Changing the default feels like taking responsibility for whatever happens next. If you stick with a pre-selected option and things go wrong, you can blame the system. If you make a change and it backfires, the blame is yours alone. The mind quietly prefers the comfort of shared error to the loneliness of personal mistake. Institutions know this. Policymakers know this. They use defaults to steer behavior, not because it is always wise, but because it is easy. Thaler and Sunstein called it a nudge, but sometimes it is less a nudge than a silent shove. The default wins, not because it is best, but because it is already there. Think about the chair you are sitting in. After a while, your body shapes to it. The longer you stay, the more it feels like the right place to be. Getting up means admitting you could have been more comfortable somewhere else all along. So you stay. Not because it is perfect, but because it is yours now. The unsettling part is how many major life outcomes are steered by defaults no one consciously chose. Pension plans, organ donation, insurance, even the apps on your phone, each one shaped by a decision made by someone you will never meet. The default option wears a halo, and you are left wondering if you picked it, or if it picked you. And when something is already yours, even for a moment, the mind begins inflating its value as if possession itself were evidence. Endowment effect. Ownership as instant inflation. The mugs were all the same. That was the point. In the late 1980s, Daniel Kahneman, Jack Netsch, and Richard Thaler walked into a Cornell classroom with a box of coffee mugs and handed them out at random. Half the students got a mug. The other half got nothing. Then they asked, "How much would you sell your mug for? How much would you pay to buy one?" The gap was immediate and huge. Sellers wanted twice as much as buyers were willing to pay. The mugs were identical, assigned by coin flip, but the moment one landed in your hand, its value swelled. This is the endowment effect. The instant something becomes yours, it stops being just an object and starts becoming a tiny outpost of self. The same mug, the same seat, the same patch of grass in a park. The only thing that changed was the word mine. It is not just mugs. Kahneman, Netsch, and Thaler ran the same experiment with lottery tickets, pens, even chocolate bars. Every time, the pattern held. Ownership inflated value. The effect is so reliable you can see it in markets, in homes, in the way people cling to underperforming stocks because selling would feel like losing a piece of themselves. Homeowners routinely overprice their houses. Investors hold on to bad bets. People defend ideas with a ferocity that makes no sense until you realize the idea is no longer just a thought. It is territory. Think about a seat on a train. You walk in, the carriage is half empty, and you pick a spot. The moment your coat hits the cushion, that seat becomes yours. Someone else sits there, and you feel a jolt of indignation, as if a rule has been broken. 5 minutes ago, you did not care which seat you took. Now losing it would feel like a theft. Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory explains why this happens. Giving up something you own feels like a loss, and losses hurt more than equivalent gains feel good. The pain of losing a mug you just acquired is sharper than the pleasure of gaining it. The mind is not weighing the object. It is weighing the story of having and losing. This is not a quirk of coffee mugs or train seats. It is a law of the mind. The moment something is yours, it fuses with your sense of self. The boundary between object and owner blurs. You do not just own the mug. The mug, in a small way, owns you. That is why negotiations stall, why people fight over heirlooms, why a child's toy becomes precious the moment another child wants it. The endowment effect is not about greed. It is about the speed with which the mind draws a border and starts defending it. The strangest part is how fast it happens. Ownership does not need years or even hours to take root. In the mug experiments, the effect appeared within minutes. The word mine is a spell. It turns the ordinary into the sacred. And the desire to avoid direct responsibility for harm then creates one of the strangest moral distortions in judgment. Omission bias. Why doing nothing can feel cleaner than doing harm. A child's life hangs in the balance, and the choice is not between danger and safety. It is between doing something and doing nothing. In 1990, Jonathan Barron and Ilana Ritov asked parents if they would vaccinate their children against a deadly disease. The vaccine carried a tiny risk of a fatal side effect. The disease, left unchecked, was far more likely to kill. But when the risk came from the shot, parents hesitated. When the risk came from inaction, they hesitated less. The numbers did not matter. The source of the harm did. This is omission bias. The mind's quiet preference for harm that arrives by accident over harm that arrives by your own hand. If a child dies because you did nothing, you can tell yourself you were passive, innocent, a bystander. If a child dies because you acted, you are the one who opened the door. The guilt is heavier, even when the math says the risk was smaller. It is not just parents. In courtrooms, juries will often forgive a doctor who fails to act, even if that inaction leads to death, while punishing a doctor who intervenes and fails. The law is supposed to weigh outcomes, but the mind weighs agency. Doing nothing feels like clean hands, even when the hands are only clean because they never touched the problem. You see it in policy too. Organ donation rates are far higher in countries where the default is to donate unless you opt out. Most people do not change the default, not because they have thought deeply, but because changing it feels like taking responsibility for whatever happens next. The same pattern appears in everything, from environmental regulation to financial planning. The default is not just a starting point, it is a shield. Think about a leaking pipe in your house. You hear the drip, you see the stain spreading, but turning the valve feels like interference. What if you make it worse? What if the pipe bursts? So you wait. You tell yourself you are being cautious, but really you are letting the problem grow, because doing nothing feels safer than risking blame for doing something that makes no sense. And you are right to be disturbed by it. The mind is not built to maximize good or minimize harm. It is built to avoid the feeling of guilt, to keep the story of the self as clean as possible, even if that means letting the world get dirtier. The real horror is how often this bias hides behind the mask of virtue. Passivity gets mistaken for wisdom. Inaction gets mistaken for caution. But the numbers do not care about your feelings. The child is just as gone. The water is just as deep. The loss is just as real. People will defend their inaction with 1,000 stories about prudence, humility, or respect for fate. But underneath, the engine is simple. Doing nothing lets you pretend you are not responsible, even when the outcome is worse. And when the future asks for sacrifice today, the mind has another reliable escape route. It discounts the later self like a stranger. Present bias, the tyranny of the immediate self. The alarm goes off at 6 in the morning. You are not surprised. You set it yourself, right before you lined up your shoes by the door and told yourself, out loud, that tomorrow would be different. That was the version of you who believed in early starts, in discipline, in the power of a single good intention to rewrite a whole day. But the person who wakes up is not the person who made that promise. The person who wakes up is negotiating, bargaining, and, if we are honest, already losing. This is not a rare humiliation. It is the daily, bodily experience of present bias. The mind does not just prefer rewards that are closer in time. It warps the entire landscape so that the immediate reward feels like a mountain and the distant one like a rumor. George Ainsley saw this in 1975, when he noticed that people would choose a larger, later reward if both options were far away. But as the smaller, sooner reward crept closer, they would flip. The preference reversed. The future self was betrayed by the present self, and the only witness was the pile of broken promises. Hyperbolic discounting is the technical name. It means that the value of a reward drops off much faster the closer it gets to now. The curve is not smooth. It is a cliff. $1 next week is worth less than $1 today, but $1 right now is worth so much more that the future might as well be a foreign country. This is why you can plan to eat healthy all week and then find yourself in the drive-thru at midnight. Why you can swear to pay off your credit card, then watch the balance climb for the sake of a small, immediate pleasure. Why the gym shoes by the door become a kind of silent accusation. It is like borrowing money from tomorrow's wallet. You know the interest is brutal. You know the bill will come due. But the present self is a master negotiator, and the future self is always outvoted because they are not in the room. The discomfort is not abstract. It is the ache in your stomach when you realize you have eaten the thing you said you would not. It is the cold sweat of a deadline you swore you would never face again. It is the quiet shame of knowing that the person you are right now is the only one who ever gets to make the call. Richard Thaler and Shlomo Benartzi saw this in 2004 when they created the Save More Tomorrow program. They knew that asking people to save more money today was a losing battle. The present self would always find a reason to say no. But if you asked people to commit a portion of their future raises to savings, suddenly the future self became generous. The program worked because it let people make promises for a version of themselves that did not have to pay right now. The pain was deferred, and so the promise could be kept. Debt, health habits, procrastination, they are all symptoms of the same trap. The mind is not built to serve a single self across time. It is built to serve whoever is holding the steering wheel right now. The self making promises and the self paying for them can feel like different people separated by only a few hours. You are not lazy. You are not weak. You are just living in a body that was designed to survive the next 10 minutes, not the next 10 years. That should bother you. Because if you cannot trust yourself across a single night, what hope do you have for the promises you make for next year or next decade? The answer is not more willpower. The answer is to design traps for your future self that are harder to wriggle out of. To move the decision point away from the moment of weakness. To treat your own mind as a negotiation between strangers who share a name, but not a set of priorities. The small humiliations add up. The skipped workout, the extra charge, the snoozed alarm. Each one is a tiny betrayal, but together they become a pattern. A life lived in the gap between intention and action. And even when we do imagine the future, we imagine our feelings there with astonishing confidence and astonishing inaccuracy.
Affective forecasting errors. How the future self becomes bad fiction. You are 22 years old, standing in a borrowed suit. clutching a letter that will decide whether you get the job you have wanted since you were a teenager. You are certain, absolutely certain, that if you get it, you will be happy for years. If you do not, you will carry the sting for just as long. This is not a guess, it feels like knowledge, but it is a fiction. In the late 1990s, Timothy Wilson and Daniel Gilbert started asking people to predict how they would feel after big moments: rejection, heartbreak, winning, losing, getting tenure, missing out. Over and over the same pattern appeared. People were terrible at guessing how happy or miserable they would be, and even worse at guessing how long those feelings would last. Harvard students predicted that being rejected from the campus drama club would leave them miserable for weeks. Most bounced back in days. Voters on the losing side of an election braced for months of gloom, then found themselves laughing at sitcoms by the weekend. Couples imagined a breakup would flatten them for a season, but the ache faded faster than they could have believed. The mind, it turns out, is a bad travel agent for the future self. It books you a long stay in misery or euphoria, but when you arrive, the weather is never quite what you packed for. This is not just optimism or pessimism.
Gilbert and Wilson called it affective forecasting, the act of predicting your own future feelings. And the error is not random. It is systematic. People overestimate both the intensity and the duration of their emotional reactions. They expect joy to last longer and pain to cut deeper than either ever does. Think of it like packing for a winter that turns out to be spring. You fill your suitcase with heavy coats, scarves, and boots, convinced you will need them all. But when you step off the train, the air is warm, the trees are already budding, and you are left sweating under layers you never needed. The mind does the same thing with heartbreak and triumph. It prepares for a blizzard, but most of the time, the thaw comes sooner than you think. The reason is something Gilbert and Wilson called immune neglect. You have a psychological immune system coping mechanisms, reframing, the quiet work of adaptation, that kicks in after disappointment or disaster. But when you imagine the future, you forget this system exists. You picture the pain, but not the healing. You see the loss, but not the way your mind will quietly stitch the world back together. So you overestimate how much a bad grade, a lost job, or a breakup will wound you. You underestimate how quickly you will find a new routine, a new hope, a new normal. In 2002, Wilson and colleagues found that people going through breakups thought they would be devastated for months. Most were back to baseline happiness in a fraction of the time. The same pattern shows up after sports defeats, failed auditions, even tenure decisions. The mind predicts a long, dramatic arc. Reality delivers a much shorter, quieter one. That should bother you, because it means the things you fear will ruin you, and the things you think will complete you. Usually both fade faster than your present self can imagine. The tragedy is that you spend so much time dreading or longing for futures that will not feel the way you expect. The relief is that you are more resilient than you know. The heartbreak you are bracing for will not last. The victory you are chasing will not fix everything. Both will become background noise sooner than you think. It is like planning your whole week around a storm that never arrives. You cancel plans. You stay inside. You watch the sky. Then the sun comes out, and you realize you could have been living all along. And the forecasts get worse still when you try to predict yourself in a different emotional state than the one you are in now. Hot-cold empathy gap. Calm minds. Predicting storm behavior. You walk into the grocery store after dinner, feeling logical, maybe even a little smug about your self-control. You buy apples, spinach, maybe some yogurt. You skip the cookies, because you are not the kind of person who needs cookies. Then, hours later, you come home from work, hungry and tired, and you find yourself tearing open a bag of chips you do not even remember buying. The person who made the list and the person who raids the pantry are not the same animal. George Lowenstein gave this split a name in 1996. The hot-cold empathy gap. When you are calm, you cannot imagine how much your own body will hijack your plans. You think you are writing rules for yourself, but you are really writing them for a stranger who will not care about your logic when the moment comes. Lowenstein's research is full of these little betrayals. In one study, young men were asked about risky sexual behaviors. When calm, they gave the answers you would hope for: cautious, responsible, even a little boring. But when aroused, the same men threw their own rules out the window. The gap between what they promised and what they did was not a small difference. It was a chasm. The calm self had no idea how persuasive the hot self would become. You see it in addiction too. People swear off cigarettes, alcohol, gambling. They mean it. They set up rules, make plans, tell their friends. But then a craving hits or a bad day lands, and the person who made the promise is nowhere to be found. The relapse is not just a failure of willpower, it is a failure of prediction. The calm self cannot feel the storm coming, so it underestimates how hard it will be to keep the promise. It is like trying to describe a fever while you are healthy. You remember that it was miserable, but you cannot summon the heat, the ache, the way your skin hurt just to touch the sheets. You know it was real, but you cannot feel it now. So you plan as if it will not return. The next time it does, you are surprised all over again. This is not just about food or addiction. It is everywhere. People in pain cannot remember what it was like to be pain-free, and people who are safe cannot imagine how fear will change their thinking. Anger, lust, exhaustion, even loneliness. Each one turns you into a version of yourself that the calm you barely recognizes. You are not just bad at predicting what you will want. You are bad at predicting who you will be. That is why policies that work, real, lasting policies, are built in the cold state, before the craving or the anger or the panic arrives. Self-exclusion programs for gambling, organ donation decisions, even the best personal rules about money or relationships, they all work better when you set them up while you are calm, for the version of you that will not be. You are right to feel uneasy about this, because it means that much of what we call poor judgment is really just poor state prediction. The mind is not just bad at seeing the future, it is bad at seeing itself in a different mood, a different body, a different storm. Your calm self routinely writes, contracts. Your hungry, furious, frightened self has no intention of honoring. And once the body has its vote, the mind starts paying special attention to what feels bad, dangerous, or insulting. Negativity bias. Why the bad news outweighs the beautiful day. You are sitting across from someone you love, and you say something careless. Maybe you do not even notice it at first, but hours later, the room is colder. The warmth you built up over weeks, the little kindnesses, the inside jokes, the shared meals, suddenly all of it feels thinner. John Gottman spent decades in his University of Washington lab watching couples argue, laugh, and drift apart. He found something brutal in the arithmetic of love for a relationship to survive. You need at least 5 good moments for every one bad. Not 2 to 1, not 3 to 1, 5. And even then, the bad moment lingers longer, cuts deeper, and stains the memory in a way the good ones never quite manage. Why? Because bad is stronger than good. In 2001, Baumeister and his colleagues published a paper with that title, and it is not a metaphor. They showed that negative events, an insult, a loss, a threat, leave a mark that is bigger, darker, and more permanent than a compliment or a win of the same size. The mind is not a fair accountant. It is a survival machine, and it keeps the ink for danger much thicker than the ink for safety. Think about it like this. Drop a single bead of dye into a glass of clear water. The color spreads, clouds, and takes over. You can pour in more water, you can add sugar, you can stir and wait, but that one drop keeps showing up. It is easier to ruin something than to perfect it. One harsh word can echo through a week of gentle ones. One bad review can haunt 1,000 good ones. The mind is built to notice the drop, not the ocean. This is not a flaw, it is a feature with deep roots. Joseph Ledoux, studying the amygdala in the 1990s, found that the brain's threat detection circuits are ancient and stubborn. They are tuned to pick up on danger, to remember the pain, to keep you alive in a world where missing a threat could mean not seeing another sunrise. Our ancestors who shrugged off the rustle in the grass did not get to pass on their genes. The ones who jumped at shadows, who remembered the bad, survived. But the world changed faster than the wiring. Now the same circuits that once saved us from predators keep us glued to every insult, every slight, every piece of bad news. The news media knows this. Social platforms know this. In 2014, researchers like Trussler and Soroka showed that negative headlines get more clicks, more shares, and more time spent staring at screens. Outrage, fear, and conflict are not just accidental byproducts. They are the business model. The mind's stickiness for bad news is now a commodity, bought and sold by the people who want your attention. You are not weak for feeling the sting of criticism more than the warmth of praise. You are not broken for remembering the one time you failed instead of the 10 times you succeeded. The system was built this way, and it is working exactly as designed. But that does not mean it is working in your favor. A single insult can outweigh a pile of compliments because the mind stores danger in thicker ink than safety. The drop of dye never really leaves the water, and that threat-sensitive brain has one more strange habit. It assumes big events must have big, meaningful causes. Proportionality. Bias. When big events demand grand causes. You are standing in the aftermath of something enormous. The news is still looping the same footage. The world feels split into before and after. And then, as the shock settles, the explanations start to arrive. But the first thing you feel is not curiosity. It is refusal. The idea that a single man, a single mistake, or a single accident could have toppled a president or brought down a skyline feels not just wrong, but almost insulting. After John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas in 1963, the Warren Commission spent months assembling the facts. They concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But the country did not believe it. Poll after poll showed that most Americans felt the story was too small for the tragedy. The scale of the loss demanded a plot, a network, a villain big enough to match the wound. The same thing happened after September 11, 2001. The official story was 19 men, a handful of box cutters, and a plan that should have failed. But the horror was so vast that millions rejected the idea that something so ordinary could have changed the world so completely. The bigger the event, the more the mind insists there must be a cause to match. This is proportionality bias. The refusal to believe that huge consequences can come from small, random, or stupid beginnings. It is the mind's way of protecting itself from the insult of chaos. If a president can be killed by a nobody, if towers can fall because of a handful of men, then the world is not just dangerous, it is arbitrary. And that is a kind of fear most people cannot sit with for long. Think of it like standing on a beach and seeing a wave taller than your house. You look for the boulder, the earthquake, the secret machine that must have thrown it. You cannot accept that 1,000 tiny pushes, wind, tide, chance, could have built something so overwhelming. The mind wants a stone big enough to explain the splash. But the world does not care about symmetry. In 1963, the president's motorcade route was published in the newspaper. The window Oswald fired from was left unguarded. In 2001, warnings were missed, protocols were broken, and luck ran out. The causes were small, the effects were seismic. And that mismatch is what makes the official story feel like a cover-up, even when it is not. Psychologists Christopher Lehman and Marco Cinderella found in 2007 that people are far more likely to believe in conspiracy theories after large, shocking events. The bigger the shock, the more the mind demands a grand design. It is not about evidence. It is about emotional math. A tiny cause for a huge effect feels like a joke at your expense. This is why conspiracy thinking so often blooms in the shadow of tragedy. It is not just paranoia. It is grief looking for a villain big enough to blame. The mind cannot accept that history can pivot on a broken lock, a missed signal, a man with a grudge, and a rifle. So it builds a story where the cause finally feels worthy of the effect. You are right to feel uneasy about this, because the moment you start needing the cause to match the consequence, you stop looking for the truth, and start looking for a story that feels fair. And that is the moment when evidence becomes optional and suspicion becomes a kind of comfort. The danger is not just that you might believe something false. It is that you might stop believing that the world can ever be changed by small, ordinary people making small, ordinary mistakes. That is the real risk. Because once the mind starts hunting for hidden order, it becomes astonishingly good at finding patterns that were never there. Apophenia. The brain that would rather see a message than noise. Close your eyes for a second. Picture the last time you saw a face in a cloud, or caught a sign in a coincidence, or felt a run of bad luck start to look like a message. You know, rationally, the clouds are just water vapor, and luck is just math. But your mind does not care. It is already busy, stitching meaning into the noise. Klaus Conrad, a German psychiatrist, saw this up close in 1958. He was working with patients who found messages everywhere, in the way people crossed the street, in the flicker of a lamp, in the static on the radio. Conrad called it apophenia. The brain's hunger for patterns turned up so high that it started seeing signals in the static. But you do not need to be in a hospital to feel it. Michael Shermer, the science writer, calls it patternicity. The mind's default setting is to connect the dots, even when the dots are just dust. You see a face in the moon. You hear your name in the shower, in the hiss of the pipes. You get 3 bad emails in a row and start to wonder if the universe is trying to tell you something. It is not, but your brain is. B.F. Skinner, the psychologist, ran a famous experiment in 1948. He put hungry pigeons in a box and gave them food at random intervals, no matter what they did. The pigeons, desperate for a pattern, started inventing rituals. One would spin in circles, another would bob its head, each convinced that its dance was the secret to making the food appear. Superstition, born from randomness. The pigeons were not stupid. They were just running the same ancient software you are. Pareidolia is the name for the moment you see a face in a cloud, or a plug socket, or the shadows on the moon. It is not a glitch. It is a feature. For most of human history, missing a real pattern, snake in the grass, a stranger in the dark, was far more dangerous than seeing a pattern that was not there. The cost of a false alarm was a moment of embarrassment. The cost of a missed signal could be your life. Think about it like this. You are in the shower, water roaring, mind drifting. Suddenly, you hear your name. You freeze. Heart rate spikes. You know logically that no one is there. But your brain is not built for logic first. It is built for survival. It would rather risk 100 false alarms than miss the one real call that matters. That is the frightening elegance of it. The brain is not just a pattern detector. It is a pattern addict. It would rather see a message than admit to noise. And nowhere does false pattern detection become more seductive than when randomness starts taking turns you swear must mean something. Gambler's fallacy. When randomness starts owing you. August 18th, 1913. The Monte Carlo casino is packed, the air thick with sweat and disbelief. The roulette wheel spins, the ball clatters, and black lands. Again and again. By the 10th time, the crowd is restless. By the 20th, people are shouting, clutching their tickets, convinced that red is not just likely, but inevitable. By the 26th black in a row, fortunes have been lost. Some gamblers are ruined, some are wild-eyed, and all of them are certain that chance itself is about to apologize for its excess. This is the gambler's fallacy in its purest form. The belief that randomness has a memory, that after a long streak, the universe is embarrassed and wants to even the score. The mind starts treating the roulette wheel like a moral accountant, keeping track of past outcomes and quietly promising that justice is just one more spin away. But the wheel does not care. Each spin is a new coin toss, sealed off from the last. The odds of black or red are exactly the same every time, no matter what happened before. The probability of black landing 26 times in a row is less than 1 in 66 million. But the probability of black on the next spin, after 26 blacks, is still just under 50%. The wheel is not haunted. It is just indifferent. You can feel the fever in the room. People start betting more, not less, as the streak grows. They are not just hoping for red. They are demanding it. They are certain that the world owes them a correction. It is the same logic that makes you feel, after flipping a coin and getting heads 5 times, that tails is now overdue, as if the coin is about to blush and make amends. This is not just a casino problem. The gambler's fallacy shows up in sports, in lotteries, in everyday life. You see a basketball player miss 5 shots and think he's due. You watch a string of rainy days and expect the sun to come out, not because the forecast says so, but because it feels like the universe should balance the books. The mind cannot stand the idea that randomness can be lopsided for so long. And then, just to make things weirder, the mind flips the script. Sometimes, after a streak, people believe the opposite, that the streak will continue. This is the hot hand fallacy. In 1985, Thomas Gilovich, Robert Vallone, and Amos Tversky showed that basketball fans and players alike believe in the hot hand, that a player who has made several shots in a row is more likely to make the next one. The numbers say otherwise. Each shot is still just a shot, but the mind wants to see patterns, to find meaning, to believe that luck is not just random but responsive. It is like expecting a coin to apologize after too many heads. You know rationally that the coin has no memory, but the feeling is so strong, so insistent, that it overrides the math. The longer the streak, the more the mind aches for balance. It is not just superstition. It is a deep, ancient urge to find order in chaos, to believe that the world is not just a series of accidents. The Monte Carlo casino did not invent this trap, but it gave it a name: the Monte Carlo fallacy. The belief that chance is self-correcting, that the universe is secretly fair, that luck is a story with a moral arc. But the wheel keeps spinning, and the odds never change. You are right to feel unsettled by this, because if randomness can run wild for hours, if the world can ignore your sense of fairness for 26 spins in a row, then what else might be out there, running on its own logic, immune to your expectations? But randomness creates a second illusion too. When something swings back toward normal, we imagine our reward or punishment caused the change. Regression to the mean neglect. The praise and punishment mirage. The Israeli Air Force instructor was certain he had cracked the code. He would watch a pilot botch a maneuver, bark out a punishment, and the next attempt would almost always be better. Praise a pilot after a perfect run, though, and the next one would usually be worse. The lesson seemed obvious. Punishment works, praise backfires. Daniel Kahneman, standing in that training room in the 1960s, tried to explain what was really happening. It was not discipline. It was not motivation. It was regression to the mean. When someone does something unusually well or badly, the next result is likely to be closer to their average, simply because luck does not line up the same way twice in a row. This is not just a pilot problem. Francis Galton spotted it in Victorian England, measuring the heights of parents and children. Tall parents had shorter kids. Short parents had taller ones. The extremes drifted back toward the middle, pulled by the invisible hand of probability. He called it regression toward mediocrity. Today, we call it regression to the mean, but the mind hates this explanation. It wants a story. So when a star athlete lands on the cover of Sports Illustrated and then slumps, fans blame the cover jinx. When a business team has a record quarter and then stumbles, managers blame laziness or bad strategy. When a student aces a test and then drops, teachers blame distraction or arrogance. In every case, the real culprit is often just the rubber band of chance, snapping halfway back. Think about it in your own life. You have a day where everything goes wrong. The next day, things are a little better, and you credit your new routine, your pep talk, your lucky socks. Or you have a day where everything clicks, and when it falls apart next time, you blame yourself for losing the magic. But most of the time, you are just riding the natural bounce of randomness. It is like tossing a coin and getting 5 heads in a row. The next toss is not cursed. It is just more likely to be normal. Because the universe is not keeping score. Regression is not moral feedback. It is statistical gravity. It does not care if you are a pilot, a CEO, or a kid with a spelling test. It just pulls the outliers back toward the middle, every time. The real danger is how many stories collapse once you see this. The coach's tirade, the manager's new policy, the teacher's intervention. So many of the things we credit or blame for change are just riding the tide of averages. The mind wants to see agency, justice, and cause, but sometimes the world is just a stretched rubber band, snapping back to where it started. And when random points bunch together on the wall of memory, we do one more thing. We start seeing design in the cluster itself. Clustering illusion, the pattern hidden in the bullet map. You are standing in a London street in 1944, staring at a map covered in tiny black dots. Each one marks where a V-1 rocket has landed. Some neighborhoods are untouched. Others are pockmarked. Clusters so dense it feels like the enemy must be aiming for them. People start whispering that the Germans have a new targeting system. The pattern is too clear. It cannot be random. But it was. After the war, a statistician named R.D. Clark took those same maps and ran the numbers. He found that the clusters, the gaps, the places that looked cursed or blessed, all fit what you would expect if the rockets had been dropped by blind chance. The randomness was lumpy, not smooth. The mind saw intention, but the math saw noise. That should bother you. Because if a pattern that feels so obvious can dissolve under a microscope, then what else are you seeing that is not really there? The clustering illusion is the brain's habit of mistaking random bunches for meaningful design. We expect randomness to look like a polite scatter, evenly spaced, no 2 points too close together. But real randomness is messy. It clumps. It leaves holes. It makes some people lucky and others unlucky, and it does not apologize. Think about raindrops on a window. You expect them to fall evenly, but they gather in patches, leaving wide stretches of dry glass. You do not accuse the sky of playing favorites. But when the same thing happens with cancer cases in a town, or with hot streaks in a basketball game, or with a run of bad luck at the casino, the mind starts hunting for a cause. In Woburn, Massachusetts, in the 1980s, a cluster of childhood leukemia cases led to panic and lawsuits. The pattern was real. The cause was not. Later studies showed that random clustering alone could have produced the same map. John Kerridge, in 1917, flipped a coin 10,000 times. He found long runs of heads and tails, streaks, that felt impossible if you were watching them live. But they were not impossible. They were inevitable. Randomness, when you look at it up close, is full of streaks and gaps. It is only when you step back, when you count every flip, every drop, every bomb, that the truth shape emerges. Sports fans see a player hit 5 shots in a row and call it a hot hand. Investors see a stock chart spike and imagine hidden forces at work. But the world is not as smooth as we want it to be. The clusters are not always clues. Sometimes they are just what random clustering alone could have produced the same map. John Kerridge, in 1917, flipped a coin 10,000 times. He found long runs of heads and tails, streaks, that felt impossible if you were watching them live. But they were not impossible. They were inevitable. Randomness, when you look at it up close, is full of streaks and gaps. It is only when you step back, when you count every flip, every drop, every bomb, that the truth shape emerges. Sports fans see a player hit 5 shots in a row and call it a hot hand. Investors see a stock chart spike and imagine hidden forces at work. But the world is not as smooth as we want it to be. The clusters are not always clues. Sometimes they are just what randomness looks like when you are close enough to see the bumps. The eerie part is how convincing the illusion feels. You can stare at a map a chart, a string of numbers, and feel the certainty rising in your chest. There is a pattern. There must be a reason. But sometimes, the only reason is that the mind cannot stand the idea of chaos wearing a human face. Real randomness is not polite. It does not spread itself out to reassure you. It bunches up, leaves gaps, and dares you to find meaning where there is none. The next time you see a cluster, a streak, a patch of luck or misfortune, remember the Londoners and their maps. Remember the coin flips and the raindrops. The pattern you see may be nothing more than the shape of chance. And the error grows when we start trusting tiny samples as if they already reveal the full character of the world. Law of small numbers. The tiny sample with huge confidence. You have a lucky week in the market. Suddenly, you are a genius. You go on 2 dates, both go well, and now you are convinced you have cracked the code of romance. You take 2 tests, both come back strong, and you start to wonder if you are just built for this. The mind does not wait for a pattern to finish forming. It grabs the first hint of a trend and runs with it, as if the rest of the story is already written. This is not just optimism. It is the law of small numbers, a phrase Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman coined in 1971. They found that people, even professional psychologists, expect small samples to behave like large ones. If you flip a coin 5 times and get 4 heads, your brain starts whispering that maybe this coin is special. If a new hire nails their first 2 projects, you start picturing them as a future star. The mind is hungry for a story, and it will take whatever crumbs it can get. But here is the catch. Small samples are wild. They swing wider, jump higher, and crash harder than big ones. In a study of hospital births, the smaller hospital had far more days where over 60% of babies were boys. The larger hospital, with more births, stayed closer to 50-50. The reason is simple. When you only have a handful of cases, randomness gets to play a much bigger role. The mind, though, does not see randomness. It sees meaning. Think about how you judge a film from a single still frame. Maybe the actor is blinking, or the lighting is strange, or the moment is between lines. You would never trust that one image to tell you if the movie is good. But when it comes to life, to business, to people, we do it all the time. A startup lands 2 big clients, and suddenly everyone is talking about a new industry leader. A manager sees 1 bad quarter and starts rewriting the hiring plan. Sports commentators watch 3 games and declare a player on fire or in a slump, as if a week of noise is enough to reveal a career's worth of signal. The problem is not just impatience. It is that the mind expects every tiny slice of reality to look like the whole loaf. Tversky and Kahneman showed that even experts fall for this. They called it belief in the law of small numbers. It's the idea that a small sample is just as trustworthy as a big one, only faster. But the truth is, small samples are more likely to produce extremes. They are the playground of luck, not law. Noise masquerades as signal when patience runs out. The world is full of streaks, slumps, and sudden turns that mean nothing at all. But the brain cannot stand to wait. It wants a verdict now. So it builds a theory from whatever is at hand and defends it as if it were built on bedrock. You are right to feel uneasy about this, because it means that much of what we call judgment is just the mind's way of filling in the blanks before reality has finished speaking. The next time you feel certain after a handful of results, remember, you are looking at a single frame and calling it the movie. And that hunger for representativeness leads directly into one of the most famous errors in all of judgment research. Conjunction fallacy. The story that beats the statistics. Linda is 31. She is single, outspoken, and very bright. In college, she majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now, is Linda more likely to be a bank teller or a bank teller active in the feminist movement? If you feel the second option tugging at you, you are in good company. In 1983, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman ran this exact question past students at top universities. 85% picked the richer story. They chose the version with more detail, more color, more narrative. The only problem is, it is mathematically impossible. Here is the trap. A conjunction two things being true at once can never be more probable than either thing alone. The odds that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement cannot be higher than the odds that she is a bank teller, period. Every extra detail you add to a story, no matter how plausible, can only shrink the circle of possibility. But the mind does not feel it that way. The mind feels the story getting stronger. This is the conjunction fallacy. It is not a rare bug. It is a feature of how we think. The more a story fits the character, the more likely it feels, even as the math quietly collapses underneath. Think of it like adding decorations to a key. Each new flourish makes the key more beautiful, more distinctive, more yours. But with every extra bump and twist, the odds that it will actually fit the lock get smaller. The story feels more right, but the probability gets worse. This is not just a trick question for psychology students. Courtrooms reward vivid stories. Journalists chase the detail that makes a headline sing. Rumors grow legs when they pick up specifics. The more a story feels like it fits the person or the moment, the more we believe it, even when the numbers are screaming for us to stop. The representativeness heuristic is the engine behind this. We judge by resemblance, not by calculation. If Linda sounds like someone who would be active in the feminist movement, that detail feels like it must be true. The mind is built to prefer a story that fits over a story that is merely possible. Kahneman and Tversky did not just find this in one classroom. The Linda problem has been run in different countries, different languages, different cultures. The result is always the same. The richer the story, the more likely it feels, even as the math gets worse. You are right to feel the jolt here. The very thing that makes a story memorable, its detail, its coherence, its fit, is the thing that makes it less likely in the world of probability. Narrative coherence does not just defeat logic. It defeats it elegantly, almost beautifully, like a magician's misdirection that leaves you applauding even as your wallet disappears. And once we start misreading risk itself, we become weirdly willing to eliminate tiny dangers while ignoring larger ones. Zero risk bias, the seduction of making one number go to zero. You are offered two choices. The first will completely eliminate a tiny risk that, if left alone, might harm one person in 1,000. The second will cut a much larger risk in half, saving dozens of lives, but never quite reaching zero. Again and again, when this experiment is run, people reach for the first option. They want the zero, not the bigger benefit, not the better math. The zero. In 1987, Paul Slovic and his colleagues ran a series of risk management studies that should have been routine. Instead, they found something quietly deranged. When asked how to spend limited resources, participants chose to wipe out a 5 in 1,000 risk entirely, rather than reduce a 15 in 1,000 risk down to 5. The second option would have saved 3 times as many lives. But the first option let them say that danger is gone. The mind loves a clean ending. You see this everywhere. Policy meets fear. In the 1990s, environmental debates in the United States became obsessed with the last molecule of a contaminant. Communities demanded that water supplies be scrubbed until not a single trace of a chemical remained, even when partial reductions would have protected far more people for far less money. The same pattern played out in public health. Lead paint campaigns poured resources into eradicating every flake from a handful of homes, while broader, cheaper efforts could have prevented more cases of poisoning. The logic was clear. The feeling was stronger. Zero is not a number to the mind, it is a category. It is the difference between some and none, between maybe and never again. The moment a risk drops to zero, it stops being a risk at all. It becomes a solved problem, a closed door, a story with an ending. And the mind which was built to crave certainty, will pay dearly for that feeling. Think of it like cleaning your kitchen. You could spend an hour scrubbing one corner until it is spotless, gleaming, hospital-grade pure. Or you could spend the same hour giving the whole floor a solid clean, leaving every part safer, but nothing perfect. The first option feels more satisfying. You can point to a patch of tile and say, "There, that is clean." The second option is better for everyone who walks through the door, but it never gives you that moment of total victory. The mind wants the victory. This is not just a quirk, it is a trap. Zero-risk bias means we routinely choose smaller real benefits if it lets us say one danger is gone completely. We will spend more, save fewer lives, and call it progress. The romance of zero is so strong that it can override arithmetic, policy, and even common sense. It is why environmental cleanups chase the last molecule, why public health campaigns sometimes fixate on total eradication, and why the word eliminate sells better than reduce. That makes no sense, and you are right to be disturbed by it. The cost of loving zero too much is paid in invisible harms. The lives not saved, the risks not reduced, the resources spent for the feeling of closure instead of the reality of safety. It is easy to imagine that if we just explain the numbers, people will choose the bigger benefit. But the mind is not a calculator. It is a storyteller. And zero is the neatest ending it knows. And even when risks are tiny, fear can make us treat them as if probability itself has stopped mattering. Probability neglect, when fear erases the denominator. You are standing in line at the pharmacy, clutching a prescription for Cipro you never thought you would need. It is October 2001, and the news has been nothing but anthrax for weeks. 5 people have died. 17 more are sick. The odds that you, personally, will ever see a tainted letter are so close to zero, they barely register on a calculator. But the fear is not doing math. The fear is ringing like a fire alarm that cannot tell the difference between burnt toast and a house fire. Cass Sunstein, writing in the early 2000s, called this probability neglect. He saw it everywhere the numbers got drowned out by the siren. After the anthrax attacks, a Gallup poll found that 45% of Americans were worried about being exposed, even though the actual odds were less than 1 in 10 million. The country bought antibiotics by the truckload, mailrooms shut down for decontamination. The arithmetic was clear, but the arithmetic was not in charge. This is not just about anthrax. It is the same mental glitch that makes terrorism, child abduction, and plane crashes dominate the public imagination, while heart disease and car accidents quietly rack up the real numbers. The mind is built to react to vivid threats, not to weigh them. When a danger is emotionally charged, the probability shrinks to a footnote. The possibility becomes the headline. Think about your own kitchen. The smoke alarm goes off for a slice of toast, and you leap up, heart pounding as if the whole house were about to go up in flames. The alarm does not care about the odds. It cares about the possibility. The mind's alarm system is the same. It rings at full volume for the rarest, most dramatic threats, and it does not lower the volume just because the numbers are small. That makes no sense. And you are right to be disturbed by it. Because if the mind cannot feel the denominator, it cannot feel safe either. The world becomes a place where any risk, no matter how tiny, feels like a coin flip with fate. The arithmetic gets bulldozed by the emotion. The first analogy is the fire alarm, but let's bring it closer. Imagine you are a parent, and you hear about a child abduction on the news. It does not matter that the odds are 1 in a million. For the next week, you walk your kid to school, check the locks twice, and scan every parked car. The fear is not lying. It is just not counting. Here is the inversion. The more vivid the threat, the less the numbers matter. The more you care, the less you calculate. The mind was built to keep you alive, not to keep you accurate. That is why a single dramatic story can erase a mountain of statistics. That is why panic is so often just the denominator collapsing into a single, blaring possibility. The punchline is not that people are irrational. The punchline is that the system was never designed to be rational in the first place. It was designed to keep you moving, to keep you safe, to make you act. But in a world where the rarest dangers get the loudest alarms, the arithmetic gets lost, and fear becomes its own kind of certainty. And once outcomes are emotionally loaded enough, luck itself starts warping how we assign blame and praise. Moral luck. Judging people by outcomes they never controlled. Two men leave the same bar, keys in hand, blood humming with the same recklessness. They drive the same stretch of road, make the same decision, press the same pedal. One arrives home to silence. The other, by a flick of timing and a child's late crossing, does not. You want to believe you judge them by what they chose. The law says it tries. But the truth is, the world's verdicts are written in the ink of what happened next. This is the problem that Thomas Nagel named in 1979. Moral luck. Bernard Williams followed in 1981, and the phrase stuck because it names something that feels wrong and yet happens every day. Two people can make the same choice with the same intent and be judged as if they lived in different worlds because luck, not character, decided the outcome. The law tries to draw a line. It asks about intent, about foreseeability, about what a reasonable person would have done. But when the outcome is a child in the road or a life ended, the line blurs. The same act driving drunk becomes a private shame for one, a public crime for the other. The difference is not in the choice, but in the gust of chance that caught one arrow and let the other fly true. You see this everywhere, in courtrooms, in headlines, in the way neighbors talk. The one who did harm is a monster. The one who did not is just a fool. But the difference is not in their hearts. It is in the world's weather. Nagel's point was not to excuse. It was to disturb. If you believe in justice as principle, you should be uneasy. Because the mind cannot help but let outcome bias slip in. We judge the decision by the result, not by what was knowable at the time. We want to believe we are fair, but we are built to feel the story, not the statistics. It is like watching two arrows released with the same force and angle. One lands harmless in the field, the other, caught by a gust, finds a target no one saw. You want to blame the archer for the tragedy, but you cannot quite say why the wind should count as guilt. This is not just a puzzle for philosophers. It is a daily fact of moral life. The law, the news, your own gut, they all struggle to separate what someone chose from what happened after. And the more tragic the outcome, the harder it is to remember that luck had a vote. We say we judge people by what they chose, yet outcomes outside their control often dominate our moral verdicts. And to protect ourselves from that chaos, the mind often reaches for one consoling fiction, that the world is fair enough for people to get what they deserve. Just world hypothesis. The comforting lie. That suffering must be earned. You are watching a woman wince as the shocks hit her, again and again. You know she did nothing wrong. You know the experimenters picked her at random. But the longer you watch, the more your mind starts to shift. Maybe she is not as nice as you thought. Maybe she made some mistake you did not see. Maybe, in some way, she deserves this. That is not cruelty. That is panic management. In the early 1960s, psychologist Melvin Lerner and Carolyn Simmons ran a series of experiments that should make you uncomfortable. They brought volunteers into a lab and had them watch another woman, a Confederate, answer questions. Every time she got one wrong, she received a painful electric shock. The twist was simple. The observers could not help her. They were powerless. And as the shocks kept coming, something strange happened. The observers began to downgrade the victim. They rated her as less likable, less competent, even less human. The only thing that had changed was their ability to intervene. Lerner called it the just world hypothesis. The idea that the world is fundamentally fair, that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. It sounds harmless, even comforting. But when reality refuses to cooperate, when innocent people suffer and you cannot do anything about it, the mind faces a choice. Either abandon the belief in a fair world or find a way to blame the victim. Most people, most of the time, choose the second. It is not just in the lab. You see it every day. Someone loses their job, and the story becomes about their work ethic. Someone gets sick, and the whispers start about their lifestyle. A woman is assaulted, and the questions turn to what she was wearing, where she was walking, what she could have done differently. The facts do not change. The need for a predictable universe does. It is like straightening a crooked picture frame instead of admitting the wall is tilted. The frame is easier to fix. The wall is the world itself, and if it is not level, then anything can happen to anyone. At any time. That is a kind of terror most people cannot live with. So the mind invents reasons, finds flaws, rewrites the story until the suffering makes sense. Not because it is true, but because it is necessary. Lerner's later work showed that this reflex is strongest when you feel powerless. If you can help, you help. If you cannot, you rationalize. The belief in a just world is not just a story about other people. It is a shield for your own emotional stability. But it comes at a moral cost. Every time you decide that poverty, illness, or assault must be deserved, you trade a little bit of compassion for a little bit of comfort. That should bother you, because it means that the need for order can quietly overpower the instinct for empathy. It means that the stories we tell about why people suffer are often less about them and more about our own fear of chaos. People sometimes preserve their belief that the world is fair by deciding the victim somehow deserved what happened. It is not a conscious cruelty. It is a desperate attempt to keep the universe predictable, even if it means blaming the innocent. And if we can defend fairness in an unfair event, we can go further still and defend unfair systems simply because they are the systems we live inside. System. Justification. Loving the cage because it is home. You are sitting in a room that feels safe because it is familiar. The mattress sags. The air is stale, but you know every shadow and every creak. Now imagine someone offers you a perfect bed in a strange house. Most people will sleep badly in the new place, even if it is objectively better. The mind does not just want comfort. It wants the comfort of what it already knows. This is the trap at the heart of system justification. In 1994, John Jost and Mazarin Banaji put a name to it: system justification theory. The idea is simple and disturbing. People are not just pressured into obeying the rules of their society. They often defend those rules, even when the rules are rigged against them. The mind does not just tolerate the cage, it polishes the bars. You might think this is about fear, that people keep their heads down because the alternative is dangerous. But the research says something colder. Jost and Banaji found that people rationalize existing hierarchies as natural, fair, or inevitable. The rich are rich because they worked harder. The powerful are powerful because they are smarter. The system is the way it is because it could not be otherwise. Even those at the bottom of the ladder often agree. In study after study, dissed den every mifrof to the poism. The visionary for my God was to you of pander da sahin joye. You've time Richard let you fought sahin. So unsure, Jack.
Affective is home. You are sitting in a room that feels safe because it is familiar. The mattress sags, the air is stale, but you know every shadow and every creak. Now imagine someone offers you a perfect bed in a strange house. Most people will sleep badly in the new place, even if it is objectively better. The mind does not just want comfort. It wants the comfort of what it already knows. This is the trap at the heart of system justification. In 1994, John Jostin, Mazar, and Banaji put a name to it: system justification theory. The idea is simple and disturbing. People are not just pressured into obeying the rules of their society. They often defend those rules, even when the rules are rigged against them. The mind does not just tolerate the cage, it polishes the bars. You might think this is about fear, that people keep their heads down because the alternative is dangerous. But the research says something colder. Jost and Banaji found that people rationalize existing hierarchies as natural, fair, or inevitable. The rich are rich because they worked harder. The powerful are powerful because they are smarter. The system is the way it is because it could not be otherwise. Even those at the bottom of the ladder often agree. In study after study, disadvantaged groups internalize the very beliefs that keep them down. Low-income participants endorse the idea that hard work always pays off.
Women rate men as more suitable for leadership. The mind does not just accept the story. It rehearses it until it feels like common sense. Why? Because stability, certainty, and shared norms make bad systems feel easier to live inside. When people feel threatened or uncertain, their support for the status quo actually increases. Jost and his colleagues found this effect everywhere they looked. In times of crisis, people cling harder to the familiar order, even if that order is unfair. The mind would rather sleep badly in a familiar room than risk the terror of not knowing where it belongs. It is tempting to believe that only the powerful defend the system, but the evidence says otherwise. Disadvantaged groups sometimes defend the system even more fiercely, because the alternative is chaos. If the world is unfair by design, then every day is a fresh wound. If the world is unfair by accident, then maybe it can be fixed. But that hope is exhausting. Certainty, even cruel certainty, is easier to carry. Think about the last time you heard someone say, "That's just the way things are," or "It's always been like this." These are not just words. They are shields. The mind is not built to live in a state of permanent revolution. It wants to believe that the world makes sense, that the rules are there for a reason, that the pain is at least part of a story with a logic behind it. This is not just a personal error, it is a civilizational habit. Whole societies can spend centuries defending arrangements that make no sense, except that they are old, or common, or blessed by the right authority. The familiar becomes the legitimate. The normal becomes the moral. The cage becomes home. You are right to feel uneasy about this, because if people can learn to love the bars, then changing the system is not just a matter of new laws or new leaders. It means asking people to sleep in a strange room, to give up the comfort of certainty for the pain of possibility. That is a much harder ask than most revolutions admit, and the system's strongest glue may be even older than ideology. Our instinct to trust the people who feel like us more than the people who do not. In-group bias. The tribe inside the thought. The bus doors open at Robbers Cave, Oklahoma, 1954. 22 boys, strangers until this morning, step into the woods with nothing but a suitcase and a name tag. By the end of the first day, they are not strangers. They are eagles and rattlers. The line between them is invisible, but it might as well be a wall. Muzaffar Sharif, the psychologist running this experiment, did not have to teach them rivalry. He just split them into two groups, gave them separate cabins, and let them invent the rest. Within days, the boys are painting flags, inventing chants, and raiding each other's bunks. They hoard food, sabotage games, and start fights over nothing. The only thing more important than winning is not letting the other side win. You want to believe this is just kids being kids. But Sharif's team tried it again and again. The pattern never changed. Give people a group, any group, and the mind starts drawing a border. Henry Tajfel in the 1970s took it further. He brought strangers into a lab, flipped a coin, and told them they were now in the blue group or the green group. That was it. No history, no reason, just a label. Still, people started favoring their own side. They gave more money to their group, trusted their group, even when the group was invented minutes ago for no reason at all. It is not just the label, It is the markers. Accent, clothing, language, a colored wristband. These are shortcuts the mind uses to sort the world. Catherine Kinsler found that children as young as 5 will pick a friend who shares their accent over one who does not, even if the other child looks more like them. The brain is not looking for logic. It is looking for a signal. Who is us? Who is them? Think about the last time you saw kids on a playground. Give them colored wristbands, and within an hour, the blue bands are inventing family names, inside jokes, and secret handshakes. The red bands are doing the same. The line between us and them is drawn with whatever is handy. It does not matter if the groups are random. The feeling is real. This is not just a childhood game. The same machinery runs under politics, sports, religion, and every flag ever waved. The mind recruits reasoning into coalition defense. Once a belief is tied to a group, the arguments get sharper, the doubts get quieter, and the evidence gets filtered through the need to belong. Political and cultural identities do not just color our opinions. They decide which facts we notice, which arguments we trust, and which mistakes we forgive. You are right to feel uneasy about this. The trigger can be so small: a coin toss, a wristband, a word, and the consequences can last a lifetime. The mind was built for tribes, for trust, for survival in a world where being wrong about who was us could be fatal. Now, the same reflexes steer us through boardrooms, ballots, and comment sections. People can begin favoring their own group after divisions, so trivial they were created minutes earlier for no meaningful reason. That is not a flaw. It is a feature from a world that no longer exists. Still running in the background of every argument, every alliance, every story we tell about who we are. And once a belief is woven into tribe and self, evidence alone rarely pulls it loose. Belief perseverance. The idea that stays after the evidence leaves. You are told a story about firefighters. Some are described as natural risk takers, the kind who run toward the flames, and you are told that this makes them better at their job. Others are described as cautious, and you are told that this makes them worse. You read the evidence, you nod, you form a picture in your mind. Then, a few minutes later, the experimenter comes back and tells you the truth. All the evidence you just saw was fake. The profiles were invented. The data was made up. There is no connection between risk-taking and firefighting skill. You would think that would be the end of it. You would think the mind would simply delete the story, sweep the table clean, and start again. But that is not what happens. In 1980, psychologists Craig Anderson, Mark Lepper, and Lee Ross ran this exact experiment. They found that even after the correction, even after being told the evidence was fabricated, participants still clung to the belief that risk-taking made for better firefighters. The facts were gone, but the explanation remained. This is belief perseverance. The mind does not just absorb facts, it builds scaffolding. It weaves a story that makes the facts feel necessary, inevitable, part of a world that makes sense. And when you try to pull the story out, you find that the roots are still there, tangled deep in the soil. You can yank the weed, but the ground remembers. It is like cleaning out a garden bed. You spot a weed, you grab it, you pull. The leaves and stem come away in your hand, but the roots are left behind, invisible and alive. A week later, the weed is back, as if nothing ever changed. The mind works the same way. You can correct a false claim, you can show the evidence was wrong, but the explanation, the why, the how, the story that made it all make sense, remains quietly shaping what you believe long after the facts are gone. Anderson, Lepper, and Ross did not just find this once. They found it over and over. They showed participants fake evidence about suicide notes, about social judgments, about risk and reward. Each time, even after a full debrief, the residue of the original belief stuck around. The mind does not like to erase. It prefers to build over ruins. This is why misinformation is so hard to correct. It is not just the claim that lingers. It is the story you built to explain it. Once you have an explanation, it becomes sticky. It feels like your own. Even when the scaffolding is rotten, the shape of it remains, guiding your judgment, coloring your memory, making the world feel more stable than it really is. You are right to feel uneasy about this, because it means that learning the truth is not always enough. The mind is not a chalkboard that can be wiped clean. It is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over older words, the ghost of the first story, always bleeding through. Which is why the next trap may be the cruelest of all, seeing bias everywhere, except in yourself.
Bias blind spot. The last safe place for ego.
Which of these traps felt like other people's problems? Not in theory, but in your gut. The one about overconfidence, maybe? The one about seeing patterns in noise? The one about defending your group? It is easy to listen and nod, to spot the flaw in the neighbor's thinking, to feel a little safer for having learned the names. Emily Pronin, Daniel Lin, and Lee Ross saw this in 2002. They called it the bias blind spot. They asked people to rate their own objectivity, then to rate the average person's. The results were not close. Nearly everyone believed they were less biased than the crowd. Even when shown evidence of their own bias, people shrugged it off. The flaw was always somewhere else. It gets stranger. In 2007, Pronin and Matthew Kugler found that people trust their own introspection as a kind of private window into truth. If you cannot see a bias in your own mind, you assume it is not there. You look at your thoughts, see no fingerprints, and call that evidence of innocence. Meanwhile, you spot bias in others with the ease of a detective at a crime scene. Now here is the punchline that should make you uneasy. In 2015, a team led by Massimiliano Scopelliti found that teaching people about cognitive biases can actually make them more confident in their own objectivity, not less. The more you know the vocabulary, the easier it is to imagine you have stepped outside the trap. You start reading a map of quicksand while already standing in it, feeling clever for knowing the names of the dangers, never noticing your feet are sinking just the same. It is almost comic, if it were not so cruel. The mind that learns about bias is the same mind that wants to feel special, exempt, a little cleaner than the rest. Introspection feels like a superpower, but it is just another story the brain tells to keep the mirror from cracking. You are right to feel the room narrow, because the last safe place for ego is the belief that you, at least, are seeing clearly, that you, at least, are the exception. But the more you learn about these traps, the more likely you are to fall for the final one, thinking you have finally escaped. So if knowing the names does not free us, what exactly was the mind designed to do instead of getting things right? The brain was built to survive, not to see clearly. You are carrying a compass. You trust it. You do not remember when you picked it up, but it has always pointed somewhere, and it has always felt urgent to follow. The trouble is, the city around you was built long after the compass was made. The streets twist in ways the old needle never imagined. Sometimes it leads you straight into a wall, and you do not realize until your nose is pressed against the brick. That is the mind you inherited. Not a machine for truth, but a toolkit for survival in a world that no longer exists. Before statistics, before journalism, before peer review, there was only the tribe, the hunt, the threat in the dark, and the story told around the fire. The mind that could act quickly, rally allies, spot danger, and spin a story that made sense. Those were the minds that survived long enough to become your ancestors. Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, in The Enigma of Reason, argue that reason itself is not a solitary searchlight for truth. It is a social tool, built for argument, persuasion, and coordination. The mind is less a scientist and more a lawyer, gathering evidence not to discover what is real, but to defend what the group needs to believe. Reasoning, in their view, evolved to help us win debates, justify choices, and keep the tribe together under pressure. The urge to be right is not a bug. It is the feature that kept you from being left behind. That is why the list you have just heard is not a catalog of random glitches. Each thinking trap is a trade-off, a shortcut that worked well enough in a world where speed and loyalty mattered more than accuracy. The availability heuristic, the halo effect, the sunk cost fallacy, these are not accidents. They are the residue of a mind optimized for a vanished environment where hesitation could mean death and certainty could mean survival. You might hope that knowing the names of these traps would set you free, but the system doing the learning is the same system generating the distortions. Bias literacy, as Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein have pointed out, rarely changes individual decisions in the heat of the moment. You can know about confirmation bias and still fall for it. You can memorize the planning fallacy and still understate the next project. The mind is stubborn because it was built to be. What does help? Institutions, statistics, peer review, adversarial debate. These are prosthetics for the mind, scaffolding built to catch the errors that individuals cannot see alone. Mercier and Sperber call them cognitive prosthetics. They are not natural. They are hard-won, fragile, and often uncomfortable. But they work, not by making you immune to bias, but by changing the environment, the incentives, and the feedback loops that shape group decisions. The mind resists correction. The group, if designed well, can sometimes force it. It is tempting to feel discouraged, to hear this list and think, I am broken. But that is not quite right. You are not broken. You are adapted. The mind you have is the mind that survived. It is just carrying a compass built for a different map. The disturbing truth is not that humans are bad at reasoning. It is that much of what feels like reasoning was shaped to protect belonging, speed, and survival before accuracy ever entered the brief. Knowing this does not make you safe, but it might make you humble. And humility, in a world built on old compasses and new streets, is the only direction that still points somewhere worth going.